Good morning, everybody, and welcome to SURF's 20-minute Neighbourhood Practitioner Network. Thank you for joining us this morning on what is, in Edinburgh at least, a fairly nice day. Still a bit cold, but a nice day. This morning's event is being recorded. If you don't want to be seen, then you can keep your camera turned off. But if you're happy being seen, then feel free to share your face with all of us as we continue our exploration in a virtual world. Housekeeping rules as normal, you should be on mute during the course of the event. And this morning for our event, for our speakers, if you've got any questions during the talk, you can put the question in the chat bar and we will attempt to answer that in the Q&A session at the end of each speaker's session. As I said, we are carrying on our inquiry into what 20-minute neighbourhoods are. We've been doing this for not quite a year, but I think since last July was when we had our first event, and we have about 200 people signed up to the practitioner network. And in that time, we've obviously seen quite a lot of interest in the 20-minute neighbourhood concept continue to rise. It was a feature of manifestos when we first began meeting for the last year's election. And then it has maintained its momentum, appearing in the Programme for Government, and then most recently being in the draft National Planning Framework 4. And 20-minute neighbourhoods aren't all about NPF4, and I think what we have established is 20-minute neighbourhoods are not all about planning. There's much more to delivering 20-minute neighbourhoods than through planning processes. But what we are aware of is that NPF4 is obviously a significant piece of Scottish Government policy. And so I thought that one of the first things we could do this morning is I could just give you a very quick update on responses to draft NPF4 and 20-minute neighbourhoods that were within that from both the local government committee within the Parliament, which was scrutinising draft NPF4, and there was a parliamentary debate just last week. And the update is brief in that it was a significant part of the committee's investigation, and it came up in a lot of the evidence that was provided to them, both in writing and in the oral sessions that they took, and in the informal oral sessions, which we participated in. SURF invited, along with a number of other organisations, a number of people to talk to MSPs about NPF4. But the formal response to the government from the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee really majored on the importance of context of delivering 20-minute neighbourhoods, really responding to what we discussed last time, which is how you deliver a 20-minute or don't deliver a 20-minute neighbourhood in rural areas within Scotland. And there's clearly a tension between the concept and its deliverability within cities and towns, and how we deliver it in more rural areas. And the committee have said that there's more detail required on that, and they're wanting to know how the principles around the 20-minute neighbourhood can be applied in a varied way within rural Scotland, but also making sure that well, not just making sure, but saying that communities have to be the driver for defining what that 20-minute neighbourhood looks like. And there's obviously quite a bit of comment around the fact that there's clarity needed, and clarity is the thing that is mentioned specifically actually around community wealth building and the 20-minute neighbourhood policies within draft NPF4. So that was a kind of formal response from the committee, asking for more detailed clarity and flexibility, with strong connections to how it links to Scottish transport policies as well. And in the debate that took place on the 19th of April, there were about 7 or 8 MSPs that brought 20-minute neighbourhoods up specifically. Again, they all majored in the fact that there needed to be flexibility as to how it was applied within a rural context, and also, again, clarity on what it could mean, really sort of emphasising things that the committee had also said in their formal response. They led the debate, and also talking about how communities can be in control of what that 20-minute neighbourhood is, and also the difference between retrofitting a 20-minute neighbourhood to an existing settlement, where there's maybe quite a bit of focus on 20-minute neighbourhoods in the planning system around new development. There was also quite strong critiques about the fact that we are up to this present point still delivering new development that doesn't conform to 20-minute principles, and that's already, we're continuing a car-centric approach under the existing planning system within Scotland. The other bit of Scottish Government information that has come out since we last met was a response from the Scottish Government and COSLA to the Town Centre Action Plan Review, which some of you will no doubt be aware of. And it had 3 paragraphs which are specific to 20-minute neighbourhoods, one of which was focusing on the fact that 20-minute neighbourhoods were an important part of NPF4 and ensuring that NPF4 supports town centre living, and that 20-minute neighbourhoods were part of that concept. Maybe more interestingly, it also makes a comment that the government plans to deliver more town centre living via Housing 2040, another big beefy document from Scottish Government from last year, by investing in a rolling programme of demonstrator locations, providing expertise, resources and matched funding to help illustrate what future town centre living and 20-minute neighbourhood models can look like. So there's something to keep your eyes peeled for. And obviously, finally, it says that there's momentum around 20-minute neighbourhoods, and that momentum needs to be harnessed as part of town centre living visions. And it works nicely with the place principle and other place-based approaches, which we know there's funding around place-based approaches. So that was the response from the Town Centre Action Plan from the Scottish Government. And actually, I will just share that, a link to that in the chat, just in case anyone is specifically interested in more details from the government's response to the Town Centre Action Plan review. So that's kind of the update up to now. So we still exist in a 20-minute neighbourhood space, which is, to me, exploratory, and still trying to gain greater understanding of what that looks like. And some of the questions that have come up in the consultation process for NPF4 are things that are going to be touched on, maybe answered definitively by some of our speakers this morning. So we have a range of speakers this morning from Living Streets, from Wright Planning, from the University of Dundee, from Como UK, and from the writer Natalie, Whittle, who wrote the 15-Minute City, which I think is now reversed because I have mirrored my screen, obviously, which is a book which I would recommend. I think I recommended it the last time we all met. I would loan it to you, but as the author is in the room, I would say no, buy it from any good bookshop, possibly Out With Books in Govan Hill, which is also a connection. Is owned by Natalie as well, so she'll be speaking at the end. And I thought it would be helpful because we hear a lot from either community groups or urban practitioners, and I thought Natalie's perspective was particularly interesting to us because she's a layperson that's not specialising in urban issues, but is bringing quite a lot of broad information together within that book. And she's going to talk about behaviour, which is one thing that came up in our very first meeting about with Ramball talking about human behaviour being the key component to delivering 20-minute neighbourhoods. And that's one of the things that we find most difficult to control. And we're obviously living in a sort of period of flux where our behaviour around movement has been changing quite significantly, primarily due to the lockdowns that we've experienced in the past 2 years. So these are some of the things that we have for you this morning. I will try and keep it to everyone's time, and we will be finished by 1 p.m. today. So we have a bit of a longer session today. We're calling it a conference. It's an online seminar, but we're giving a bit more time to the 20-minute neighbourhood discussion this morning. And on draft NPF4, I think it's worth noting that I think there were over 750 responses to the government consultation on the National Planning Framework, which is a healthy amount. Somebody will be reading them at present. And it may be notable that in the parliamentary debate, and last night as well, I was at an event and Tom Arthur, the Minister for Planning, was there. And it's notable that he is not given a deadline for when NPF4 will be completed or published. He said it will be published when it's ready, and that good things take time sometimes. And he was very specific in the conversation last night, saying people can read into that what they may, but it gives no deadline to it, which in some ways is good because I think there was obviously quite a lot within the responses to NPF4 that needs some deeper thinking, and some of that deeper thinking is going to happen this morning. So our first speakers this morning are Stuart Hay and Anne Doherty from Living Streets, who many of you will be familiar with. And they've been doing some work, I think sponsored by Scottish Government in North Lanarkshire. And so we've invited them to speak to us about their initial findings in that, and presumably to tell us a bit more about living streets for those who are less familiar. So Stuart, I think you are speaking first.
Yep, good morning, everybody. I'm going to set the scene for Anne's talk on North Lanarkshire. I'm going to mute a second and clear my throat. Not mute, sorry. Right, that's better. I bet you're glad this is online. Right. Yes, I'm going to set the context. I say a lot about living streets and some of the background to our work on this. Can you see the whole? Can you see my whole screen or part of the screen? That's the first thing to ask.
I can see I can now see part of the screen. So
right, hang on.
You need to do slideshow. Yeah.
From the right.
That's it.
Technical going right. Okay, so starting off with, are we talking about wishful thinking in terms of 20-minute neighbourhoods? You'll get the impression that I'm quite cynical about this. I actually think 20-minute neighbourhoods is a brilliant concept, but only if it actually happens. It's not something we just talk about. It's actually something that's real to communities. And that's what Anne's going to talk about in the second part of the talk. I'm going to focus in on some of the context, why we got involved in this. A little bit about Living Streets. We are the Pedestrians Association. We're founded in 1929, mainly because of the pressures on communities, road safety issues around the growth of motor cars. And we're still there, we're still here, but we reformed in about the millennium and we became Living Streets, which sort of broader urbanist feel to what we do. Our current work programs include lots of work around schools and getting kids to walk to school and get support for parents helping their kids walk to school, and also helping communities improve their streets. And that's what Anne focuses on and she'll talk about a little bit later. As I mentioned, this isn't a new problem, but it really became a big problem in the 60s, and the government recognised this and they commissioned a Scottish planner called Colin Buchanan to say, what do you do about all this traffic in towns? And there's a seminal report about this. And he said, you've got a choice, basically. You can either start knocking stuff down to make room for vehicles and traffic flow, or you keep the vehicles out. And it's quite controversial depending on your views about this, because it was interpreted in different ways in different places. You can see this sort of full vision in the new towns, really. In other places, this was really fudged, and we've been fudging it for the last 50, 60 years, unfortunately. And as I'll show, we kind of know what problems that causes. And another planning document that I would like to bring up, and this is something I studied when I was at university, showing my age here. So back in the 90s, just before I graduated, MPPG 17 came out, and that's talking about let's start seeing a move away from car-based planning towards something that starts to tackle traffic growth. And you'll notice the word should, and I'm going to refer to the word should a lot in this presentation, which is deliberate. And there's lots of repetition in this presentation, which is also deliberate, but I will also include some furry animals just to break that up a bit. And then we got to 2010 and we tried to basically take away the highway manuals and take a more place-based focus in terms of that. And we have designing streets. And you'll notice that there's should, but there's also must consider, which I think is an innovation on should, but that's basically our planning policy. And it also asks for a multidisciplinary collaborative approach to how we do these things at a local level. So that was designing streets, and that's still in force, and that's still what we should be doing. And it basically is part of the Designing Places agenda, and it's talking very strongly about walkable neighbourhoods and actually significantly reducing journeys, and that's a Scottish Government policy from 2013. So this has been around a while. And then we've got to MPF4, and this might now sound quite familiar, as you can see by the appearance of the Groundhog Day, that planning should contribute to the creation of walkable and livable and thriving places. I won't go into the whole thing, but it's the same narrative. So this is well-established policy. We're not talking anything innovative, new. This has been around for a while. And there we have creating places, which I'm slightly worried by the cover, which is on a very blank piece of paper, which is kind of like some of the streets that got created by it. Monoblock has been the crest of innovation really in street design, mainly for drainage purposes, but unfortunately they also took away the pavements as well and create shared spaces in a lot of areas, which is now hopefully something we're not doing. But yeah, that is where we've got to. We looked at these issues in depth about 3 or 4 years ago for the Scottish Government and working with what is now Como UK to actually see how does this policy work in practice. We were hearing a lot of issues that places aren't walkable, so we went and looked at them, and we deliberately tried to pick places that were decent. We didn't go to the worst places. We tried to find places that had some type of award or accolade or something like that. So that this is the best that the industry could provide. And then we revisited some of the sites because they were in development. They hadn't been built yet, so we went to see another phase of them in 2020, and some additional sites. As part of the research, we asked planners, do you think this stuff works? And the answer from the practitioners was they were pretty unconvinced themselves. So I think the ones that said no were the honest ones, to be honest, but that's my personal bias, but I'm going to back that up with some evidence in a second. I think the maybe is probably meant no, but and the yes, well, I'm not sure where they are planning about, but I've not been to those places yet. So if anybody knows, you can tell me about these Carfleet places. So what we found, so one of the sites we looked at was the Commonwealth Games Village, and all these sites had good points, and this had nice links to the Clyde and actually some, but it was kind of out on its own. It was close to the subway station, but actually there was no facilities on site at all. And when we spoke to the people there, they were getting their daily essentials from an ice cream van that was basically stationed there 24/7. I mean, this ice cream van will have done great during the lockdown. It may well have retired on the back of what happened in lockdown, but that was the facilities they had in a new housing development. The Forge Park Head was there, but you had to walk through a kind of industrial wasteland to get to it. It wasn't so. The facilities, and we did a place standard analysis in each of these places, and that was there. And you can see there's just a big wedge missing out of that in terms of there was no facilities we could see there, and the public transport was a little bit weak, especially the buses there, and that was a recurring theme. We looked at Winchborough, which is on the left there, and that's a very car-dominated site. Very big project, very big master plan project in West Lothian, catering for housing in the sort of greater Edinburgh area, travel to work area. A very car-dominated type of development, very lacking. It basically had the facilities it started out with in terms of a small village and then lots of housing. We also, on the positive side, looked at Aberdeenshire and a place called Chapelton, which was more sort of a planned development that the landlord had. So a different model and much higher degree of urban design and context and much less car dominance. And the point I make is these two developments were designed under the same planning system, but are miles apart in terms of how they look and feel. Both sort of problematic because they're out of town, but at least there's an effort in Chapelton to encourage people not to use their cars. And you can compare the two there, and Chapelton is actually quite a holistic development in terms of our understanding what a place could, from our interpretation of the place standard. When we started looking at it, we felt that it was quite well balanced. It was quite an affluent area. There was still quite a lot of people with cars, so it was not, by far is not a car-free development. But you can look at Winchborough, and again, this is a high-profile, very master plan development, really lacking in facilities, local jobs, and public transport. It's just what you would find pretty much in a lot of these developments. Very, very typical, I would say. And the interesting thing about Winchborough is actually it's marketed on the basis that you will drive around. That's why you would live there. That's who it's marketed to. And there's an assumption. It even says you're right next to the dual carriageway. You can jump in your car and get anywhere. Whereas Chapelton actually did make an effort to talk about some of the other options and things as market. So that, you know, pulls apart. Another thing about Winchborough is that in theory it should have a station, but the station's never been built. Now everybody's moved in. They've got their 2 cars. They're not going to buy a season ticket to use the station. That train has gone. This is just a little bit of a tour around another development that I did a talk for RTPI about two years ago, and I just went out to the Southeast Wedge to see what was out there. And again, it's car based. There's very little public transport. There's a bus stop, but it's not a bus shelter, and actually you can't get to the bus stop because somebody's parked in front of it. And I think I left the Vogon in from another talk. That's the sort of this type of planner you find in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, who tends to build lots of roads everywhere. So including an intergalactic highway that destroyed the Earth. But anyway, I will keep going. As you can see, that is the sort of planning we're dealing with. This is Pennycook, which is just outside of Edinburgh. This is where my sister actually moved in, so I got to go there quite. And the point here is it doesn't look very different from the type of place I grew up in the 1970s, which was designed around the car. And this was built last year or so. And there's actually a mix of different housing in there, which is some of it's from the 70s, some of it's from 2020. Can you tell the difference? And this is the type of infrastructure. Is this going to encourage anybody to walk or cycle? It's say that's saying it's actually dangerous here if you're putting barriers up to walk. That's the signal it's giving. And then if you need a big roundabout, well, then you're going to deal with a lot of cars. You're Southeast Wedge again, and again the infrastructure pressures here. There's an assumption that this is going to we're going to have to upgrade the Sheriff Hall roundabout because of so much housing. So that's a planning fail. And we're all paying for that. That's money. That's 250 million pounds that developers have cost us, and the planning system has cost us through not planning. And just the other side of this, if people have to drive everywhere, you're out to town. And this was last autumn, another drive-through built in Glasgow, which, given its health record, I don't think more burger drive-through bars is what Glasgow needs. And I think it's very brave and sensible of the council there to say they're not going to have that anymore. And I would say other forms of development are available. This is actually an eco-village in the north of Scotland at Finhorn, built under the same planning system with a different ethos. It does have local facilities, actually 10 miles an hour, not car dominated at all, reasonable density, reasonable green space. Coming back to the background to this, this is the research that Paths for All did into walking issues. And actually, we do have the basis of some 20-minute neighbourhoods in some places. We do have a bus service of sorts that supports us, and we do have local shops, and we do have primary schools, and people seem to be prepared to go to green space. So there's some elements there. After that, it sort of breaks down, and it's by no means universal. And there's a mismatch between how far people are prepared to walk and what's actually available. And there's two ways of changing. We have to either bring stuff closer to people, make it quicker to walk places, which we can do by more direct routes, or we operate or open new facilities at a local level. So there's lots of things you could do to bridge that gap, and that's really what at the heart of 20-minute neighbourhoods. And there's demand for that. When people were asked what in terms of where you live, what's important? Local facilities, regular bus services, a train station, and actually close to places of work. And being near to the town centres wasn't actually as important. But our retail parks, which is one of the things the planning system is delivering in terms of future commercial premises, there's still a lot of that stuff being delivered. And actually, safe routes for cycling wasn't the big thing, although that's seen as a silver bullet. It's not actually what people want. It's not saying it's not important, but at the moment, there's a behaviour change shift to get people to buy into that. Very inconvenient truth here. This is Donald Bergswick. He looked at Medicare for Obama, and he said every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. So the planning system actually is doing what it's designed to do at the moment. It's creating what it's creating. And the other thing, this is an environmental economist, most systems are self-replicating. So once they start going, it's very difficult to turn them around. I think that's the case with planning. And I would say this is actually what we've got in terms of planning policy. This is what it delivers. If we're just looking at the outcomes we've got, this is what we've got at the moment. This is what we're dealing with. If you take away that it's not what's in the policy documents, it's what's out there and what we've seen in communities. And that's what we need to change. And we need to be honest about that. So when we're missing the bigger picture on this, the policy should be working. It's been around for years. So why is it not? The first thing is we need to start thinking about people as well as places and what motivates them. And actually, the Scottish Government has a really good tool for doing this. It's the ISM tool, behaviour change tool, which was built around for climate change, but it's rooted in behaviour change theory. It's a smorgasbord of behaviour change theory that's been melded together and takes a lot of stuff from public health campaigns and stuff. So we actually do know how to understand this and do it. So I would recommend this tool to people. It should be used more often. And we need to think about individuals' beliefs, what they're thinking about. And we also have to think about how, social networks reinforce those beliefs about whether you should be driving around all the time and that it's normal to drive everywhere, and that people who walk around communities are a bit weird and a bit strange. And that is actually the reality. And we need to be broader and not just thinking in physical terms about altering streets, but actually working with people and not just putting signs up, for instance, and assuming that behavior will change and things like 20 miles an hour. Massively complicated slide here, which is deliberate. We have to think about this, not just about the bits that we know about. So I'm interested in payments and walking and all that sort of stuff, and quite interested in public transport, which is the top of the thing. But doing those on their own, I think will have no impact unless we actually take a very holistic approach and a whole systems approach. And I think the environment sector is very bad at not understanding business and vice versa. And there's some fundamentals about setting up local facilities that we have to get our heads around. And having viable facilities does take business people with a bit of nous, but they do need to rent, land availability. And I think land reform is something that Anne might touch on a little bit, but land reform is actually quite important in all of this, and finding the space to create these facilities. And it's not easy, and it's not easy to do. It's not easy at a micro scale, even in terms of providing little bits of cycleway or footway. If it's sometimes just not worth the effort, and we get poor infrastructure and things like cleanliness. So we need to think about the business essentials in all of this. I think good walking infrastructure can improve. So if the fundamentals are already there, then investing in this stuff will make a difference. Rather than that complicated slide, you can just look at it and test the community. And basically, if you can't buy a toilet roll within 20 minutes walk, you've failed as a plan, as a planning policy, as planners. And we need to be able to, and it should be affordable as well, which I think in some places you will struggle with in terms of the shops that are there. And I say that comes back to the business fundamentals that are back at the end. And the last point, and this is from a professor in America, if you plan for cities for cars and traffic, you get cars and traffic. If you plan for people and places, you get people and places. And that's what we should be doing, and that's what we say we're doing, but we're not. But we could still start doing that if we just put our policies into practice. And I'm going to hand over to Anne, if I can get her slides up and running.
Thank you, Stuart. Yes, and thank you for showing my slides. Good morning, everybody. My name's Anne, and my computer is just playing up this morning, so Stuart is very kindly showing my slides. So if you want to just go on to the first slide. Thanks. So as Stuart outlined, there's a huge background to planning for 20-minute neighbourhoods. And we were commissioned to go and speak to communities about what 20 neighbourhoods might mean to them. Would they like a 20-minute neighbourhood? What would it look like? So as Ewan said at the outset, our research is at fairly early stages. So we went out and just asked a fairly simple question, or what you might think would be a fairly simple question, about how easy or difficult it is to get around and get to where you want to go on a daily basis. And the answer to that was mixed, as you might expect. And people said for some things, yes, and for other things, no. And that was where the conversation would start. So next slide, please. When we went to, that's great, thanks. So really, I could sum up a lot of what we learned in this one slide, which was simply, if you can't make the whole journey on foot, you can't, it's no use. You can't have a bit of a 20-minute neighbourhood. And these photographs were taken in Shotts in North Lanarkshire, and it was to illustrate that they have a lovely health centre in Shotts, and to get to one of the housing estates in Staines, you could walk. It's around about a 20-minute walk, and people would be, some of the people we spoke to would be willing to walk that way, but they can't walk it. It's not possible to walk it because unless they are fit, able and determined, because the lovely walk that goes through the green space, you suddenly come across the steps in the photo on the right. And if you try and stick to the pavements, you get to a road that doesn't effectively have a pavement, because on one side there's no pavement, and the other side the hedges are so overgrown that the narrow pavement becomes impassable and you have to walk on the road. And those are the routes. So, you know, and the people we spoke to, one of them had visual impairment, and she has a guide dog. She walks her dog, she walks it in the park, but she can't walk to the health centre. It's simply not an option. Next slide, please. Another issue that was raised, and it's also what Stuart has alluded to, that land ownership is a major issue. So these photographs here, the one on the left is of the station car park in Caldercrooks, and the cars that you can see parked in it were the people that had come to do the street audit with me that day. And they were telling me that actually usually there's no cars in it whatsoever. It's completely not used. It's across the road from the rail station, and for whatever reason, if you go a couple of miles down the road to Drumgelach, that is clearly a commuter car park, and that car park has always got cars in it. It has enough cars that there's been a pop-up coffee shop that now you can go and get a coffee whilst you're waiting at the station there. So that it's enough to keep the coffee shop in business. So a lot of people are using the station at Drumgelach. And although a lot of people use the station at Caldercrooks, they're not using the car park. And immediately backing onto the car park, there is an area of housing who have been in touch with the council to ask for more parking because they don't have enough parking for their cars. Now, we can debate whether we want them to be parking and having more parking, but it seems to me there's a mismatch here. And so when you look at the place standard or the 20-minute neighbourhood and the sense of influence and control, the community were saying that basically they would love to either walk through the car park to get to the train station or to even park their cars in the car park. But that car park is owned by Network Rail and they have no influence whatsoever. So that's a wee project that we're actually going to take on and see if we can come up with a solution for. But it just shows you that 20 minutes access public transport, it's not as simple as that. Next slide, please. The other massive bugbear, and I think this comes down to the sort of planner's view of what is a walkable area, and if you put in paths, then it becomes walkable, and a community's view, which is if you put in paths, you need to maintain them. It's a bit like the capital and revenue debates within local authorities and funding for different things, because care and maintenance is a massive issue for every single group of people I've spoken to. And we've, over the years, for this project, we've not managed to speak to as many people as we would like because of COVID when we were doing the community engagement. We still spoke to a couple of hundred. But over the years, we've spoken to various groups of people, and there hasn't ever been a time where people haven't talked about care and maintenance. So for walking around, people want to walk in attractive places, but not just because they want them to be attractive, but because the practical reasons as well. about feeling safe. That as we did the walk, the photograph on the left there was taken just very recently when I was down in Whittle in Airdrie. And one of the people I was walking with is a childminder, and as we walked along, she was doing a risk assessment, and she said, well, I couldn't bring any of the children I look after here because there's so much glass around, it just wouldn't be safe. So it's not just about it looking nice, it's a practical aspect of care and maintenance. The picture on the right is just a pavement, and it's on the route to a bus stop, and because of the high curb on the left, even if you wanted to, often obstacles on the road force people onto obstacles on the pavement force people onto the road. But even if you wanted to try and get onto the road, you'd be struggling if you had a buggy, far less a motor scooter, as a walking frame or a wheelchair. So you just simply wouldn't get past. So people link the lack of care to feeling less safe. People say they can't go places. And however lovely the 20-minute neighbourhood idea is, if you don't have money for care and maintenance, then it won't become a reality. Next slide, please. Another aspect of the 20-minute neighbourhood is to have attractive and suitable facilities. And people told us at various places we went to that they would love to have more shops, and if they had, that would be great, and they would be delighted. A lot of people were very proud of their village, very happy to live where they live. There's a lot of positives. They liked being where they were, and we went to a mixture of places. Airdrie town, which is definitely rural. Calder Crooks, I'm not sure if that counts as rural or urban. It's about 3 or 4 miles from Airdrie, but it's slightly out. Is Shotts rural or urban? You can tell me. But there was empty premises that again were owned by landowners, and the area around them was in very poor condition, and the council were struggling to do anything to even get in hold of the landowners to have a conversation about saying, could you please tidy up your land? But as well as that, the community centre in Calder Crooks is effectively, it would seem, been allowed to go into rack and ruin just because there's been no money to maintain it and upgrade it. It now gets flooded regularly, and it's not used as a community facility because it's just not fit for purpose. And one of the people we spoke to said shopping is so poor across North Lanarkshire, and you just get bookies and pubs, some cafes, but it's not good enough to bring people in or encourage them to stay local. So communities fundamentally understand that is what Stuart was saying about the importance of business. If there's no businesses there, if there's no thriving community shops and somewhere to visit, no walking destinations, then how does that fit with the 20-minute neighbourhood idea? Next slide, please. Another aspect of place standard and of 20-minute neighbourhoods is safety, safe crossings, safe cycling facilities, and again, it's just not borne out. And we know, for example, that from a road safety point of view, and road safety is a statutory obligation within the local authorities, but the definition there of road safety is no fatalities. So a nice empty road where nobody tries to cross is a very safe road. And if you say to them, this isn't a good crossing point, and they count and say, well, nobody's crossing here, it's, well, because nobody wants to. On the other hand, some places there's no choice but to cross. And again, people told us that they know of crossings. The photo on the left of the person in the middle of the road with the dog, that is a B road that goes through a village, but it's a 60-mile-an-hour limit going through a village, and there's really no visual cues if you're walking through the village to say that you're coming, or sorry, driving through the village to say that you're coming to a 60-mile-an-hour road, or if you're on the 60-mile, you're turning into 30. It's not a safe place. And people basically just said, we'd like safe places for walking. We would walk more if it was safer. And so that's, something we found in all the towns and villages that we've been to, safety for crossing places. And I think there's a difference between the planning definition of, the council definition of safe places for crossing and perceptions of safety. And there's nowhere that says that you've got to, you know, the 20-minute neighbourhood aspiration is that we should consider pedestrians. They should, and we know now that they're at the top of the hierarchy for the highway code, but that's not borne out by communities' experience. Next slide, please. And then here's the rub. Public transport. It's absolutely a massive issue for communities. There's just, you know, I don't even know where to start. I don't know what to say. Communities are so frustrated. The evenings in particular are a complete disaster. There's a good example. I was talking with Stuart earlier, and we were saying that now with the bus pass for free bus travel for young people, but if you take the village of Caldercrooks again, most of the youth services are in Airdrie, and during the day, the young people can get a bus into Airdrie, but any service for them must finish by 6:30, otherwise they'll not get home again. So how does that work? Yes, they can get a free bus. Now, they do have a train station. You saw the car park earlier, but that costs them money. For older people, the train station is at the bottom of the village, at the bottom of the hill in the village, and doesn't take them up the hill. So getting up the hill is difficult, and it's quite a long walk for people. Using buses, we spoke to in other projects, worked with specifically older people, and one of the things that they'll tell us is getting information is really, really difficult. And that's been particularly around people considering stopping driving and moving to using buses. They don't know where to start. They don't know how to find out about buses. Getting information, it's really difficult. A lot of it, if it's there, is online, and for many people that doesn't work. So public transport is a massive issue, and has to be at the centre of the 20-minute neighbourhood discussions, I think, or at least that's what it happens when I speak to communities. They put public transport very much at the heart of the discussion. Next slide, please. Just to remind everybody that we can be positive, and there are good things, that small changes can make a big difference. And one of the other things that people tell us is just somewhere to sit down, if I could just have a rest. So, you know, we have had some success with putting in benches, but we're also aware that the rate of putting in a few benches project by project, I would probably be 432 before we managed to make a significant difference to the world of active travel and of 20-minute neighbourhoods if we just go project by project, bench by bench. So there needs to be a much bigger approach, a much more holistic approach, but small changes can make a big difference. So that's the positive slide. Next slide, please. So we can make a difference, and the devil is in the detail, and I think that reflects back to what Ewan was saying in his introduction, that you know, and in some ways it's really good that NPF4 is taking time to look at things in a bit more detail. But I do think, as well as the plan and the design, it's the care and the maintenance and the ongoing revenue costs and how we do it. We can make a difference. We do need to involve communities. We need to put them at the heart of it. We need to understand the issues they tell us about. But in terms of the retrofitting the existing communities, we absolutely have to have the resources to respond. If there's no good in going out and consulting with communities and asking them what a 20-minute neighbourhood, if we then, because they are so frustrated. They're like, well, they know that councils have had funding cuts. They know that land ownership means the council can't influence that bit of land. They are very aware of the limitations of what can be done within existing budgets, and obviously we're coming into a very difficult time with cost of living and budgets for councils and others, but it's something that's very real for communities. So we do need to ask, we do need to involve, we do need to understand, but we absolutely need to have the resources, whether that's human resources in terms of council staff to clear litter and fly tipping issues, or whether it's money to improve roads and put in crossings. We need to have the resources to respond. And I think the last one is just to say thank you. So final slide.
Thank you very much, Anne.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart, as well, both for your presentation and for sharing Anne's one as well. I'm just gonna, if you want to, Stuart, if you want to unshare your screen, thanks very much. So thank you very much to both of you. And I think you've picked up on really important points. And I know where your focus is, but the fact that you mentioned rates, rent, land value as being a really important part of how we deliver these certainly comes up, and it's something that's come up in the town centre review recommendations, rates and rents being something in particular, and tricky for government to respond. One of the questions that has been put to me is around the ISM toolkit, Stuart. Now I've just popped something into the chat, which I found on Scottish Government, which is from 2013. But if you've got anything more recent, then pop that into the chat. But reflecting on what you've both said, the issue around how do we make, like you, Stuart, I've given presentations that said for 20 odd years, we've had the same policy saying, yeah, we should have walkable neighbourhoods. And we don't have them. We're not delivering new ones consistently. How do we reframe the policy to make it deliverable over the next 10 years?
I think, I mean, there's nuances in what should and must in terms of what has legal force, but I think plans should be able to just say these are fundamental, you must do them, and we must be better at defining this stuff. What is a good pavement? We don't actually know what a good pavement is. I would say it's about 2 meters wide. But no planning document will actually tell you that. For a good pavement for me is you can actually walk with a buggy, a kid, side by side and pass somebody going in another direction, which isn't unreasonable, but that's almost seen as asking for the moon in terms of where certain developers and councils are coming from. So we need to be precise about that and defining what is the level of service we should be seeing in communities before they're built, or of what are we aiming for in terms of trying to retrofit, and not just saying we're going to put in a lot of cycleways. That's important, but we also need to have somewhere to cycle to, and as places that communities actually want. And I think there's just places we're working in and there's just stuff missing, and we know what they are. And then you get back to the planning system has to be interested in the fundamentals of business, and councils and government need to be able to make these things work. There's people out there that I'm sure would want to run small businesses providing things like shops, cafes, that things. I might be wrong, but I think there is. But they have to be able to make a living out of it, and I don't think in enough places there's the facilities to do that. So we just need to dig a lot deeper into how the policies work.
It says we should be more prescriptive rather than some of the generalised ways. And I think if anyone's interested in the parliamentary debate, Graham Simpson examined the planning policies and basically said all the planning policies have get-out clauses, and the planning system means all things to all people, which is the nature of our discretionary planning system, but it is obviously the challenge when we're trying to force change to happen. Winchborough is somewhere that I knew quite well in the late 80s, and I went recently for the first time in a long time, and I was like woefully depressed at what's happened in Winchborough. I had heard things about it that made me more hopeful, but it was quite depressing to see what's been delivered there, and the absence of the train station is pretty appalling. It's not an infrastructure first approach, that's for sure. But Anne, you and I have talked before this around culture and behaviour and around cars, because what we're talking about is trying to move people into be more active. Do you think some of the things that you identified in Calder Crooks, how would you change people's relationship with the car, do you think? Is it all stick that it's too difficult to drive, or? I
do think there needs to be quite a lot of stick. I think it's quite interesting though, because a lot of people in Calder Crooks don't have a car. A lot of people in North Lanarkshire don't have a car. And I think if they don't have the same choices, and I think that's an issue. But for those that do, and increasingly, of course, car ownership in the Calder Crooks is getting higher because there's lots of new housing, because there's a train station, and therefore people can live there and use the train, and so the demographic is changing probably. I think people are very attached to their cars, and I think we do need to do a lot of behaviour change. I think it's about the raising awareness, but at our walking seminar recently, we talked about the analogy of smoking and how we went from smoking, and I kind of think that's a really good analogy. And I think the need to actually do both the raising awareness that leaving your car at home is a good idea, but also making, but I think it has to be more, I think it has to be about having viable alternatives, because the evidence would show people will sit in a traffic jam for 2.5 hours because there was an accident on the city bypass, get home, moan about it, and go and do exactly the same thing the next day, knowing that there could also be an accident. There probably won't be, but so, you know, people's tolerance for inconvenience in cars is remarkably high, I think. And so you have to make public transport and walking to, and we have to, because there's studies, you know, we often talk about active travel and 20-minute neighbourhoods about walking everywhere, but I think there is a reality, and we've talked about this in terms of the rural, that if you can't walk, you at least if you're using public transport, you're walking to the public transport, you're still walking and being moving more. And I think it's that link, and public transport we have to make that more. When I was with a group yesterday, in fact, they were talking about back in the day, and there was a family-run bus company that did the buses through Airdrie and out to the villages. And the driver basically knew who was going to use the bus and would go to where they wanted and drop them off and go around the routes that they wanted. And because he knew them, and he knew them over years, and you know, and it met their needs. It actually, they said, you know, you could just get a bus and you could get to where you needed to go to. We had that system in place, and that has changed, and it's all gone, and you have to walk to the bus stop and walk far. So I think the behaviour change, I think it is about making it a bit more uncomfortable for cars, but I think it's the carrot is getting alternatives there. I think we have to do that.
I think your point on care and maintenance, that's the thing that I've heard over the decades. Whenever we talk about, you know, making urban interventions, it's basically care and maintenance that's yes. Fundamentally needed around our public realm and our buildings. And that's certainly something that came up around some of the work we did with MSPs around NPF4. People were talking about care and maintenance of things rather than totally new things. But public transport is also, we're doing some work on looking for a new site for Alliance for Action, and public transport and small settlements is a major issue. It's out of control of the local authority. There's a drop in demand, which means they're dropping services even further, which disadvantages the disadvantaged even more. Thank you very much for both of your presentations so far. Time is pressing on, but there's an opportunity for us all to chat at the end of this. So if there are some questions in the sidebar, and we can maybe pick up on them at the end. But thank you very much, both Stuart and Anne.
Thank you.
We are now moving on to Nick, who I think may pick up on some of the things that have come up in the presentation that we've heard, but he's looking at some specific case studies. And I think this next presentation is hopefully going to respond to some of the questions that are coming up around rural living and living well locally in a rural context and around sort of connected settlements. So Nick, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Ewan. And thanks for inviting me along. Good to see so many people here, quite a few of whom have been involved in this work. So thank you all very much for your input. We just finished the draft report last night, so this will all be published next month. But the things I'm about to show you are still draft. There's a few tweaks to do to them, but it should be interesting, I hope. The trigger for the work that we're doing, it was commissioned by Hightrans, the regional transport partnership for the Highlands and Islands, and by Sustrans, in response to concern that they'd heard amongst the Highlands and Islands that they might miss out on what feels like quite an urban focused concept in draft NPF4 in terms of 20-minute neighbourhoods. So urban focused in that there's a focus on walking in there, and clearly in many bits of the Highlands you cannot walk to reach facilities in 20 minutes. And also the word neighbourhood is quite an urban feeling word as well. If you live in if you're in a town or city, it probably feels normal. But is that the right word for the Western Isles or for Orkney or for Argyll and Bute? So the purpose of our work was not so much a critique of how things are at the moment. And I think Anne did that brilliantly just now in showing how things are in North Lanarkshire. So it's how to respond to that critique. We've got a rural focus because it's the Highlands and Islands. I think it's relevant probably to most of rural Scotland, but But if you're in an urban area, don't switch off, because hopefully the process that we went through might be of interest as well, and also the outputs hopefully too. So the two questions that were posed by Hitrans and Sustrans were, first of all, what could a 20-minute neighbourhood look like in a rural and island context? And secondly, what would need to happen for a rural settlement to become a 20-minute community? So to unpack those questions, obviously the first thing we did was look at all the good work that's been done already. There's the work internationally, which a lot of you will know, for places like Paris and Melbourne and Detroit and various other places around the world. There's been good work in Scotland, such as the Ramble work, which you mentioned earlier on last year. And there's a lot more work done since then by, for example, Scottish Rural Action, the TCPA down south. Some local authorities here are doing good work, like the City of Edinburgh Council have produced a 20-minute neighbourhood strategy for Edinburgh. There's good work in Orkney, there's the work in Aberdeenshire as well that's happening. So we will cite links to all those bits of work in the report that comes out next month, to save everyone having to do what we've been doing and hunt around for it. So that'll all be in there, and we want to build on that. And as Stuart said, it's a great ambition, 20-minute neighbourhoods. I mean, to jump to the conclusion of the work, it could well be workable in the Highlands and Islands with resources, as Stuart and Anne were saying, and with some simple tweaks to draft MPF 4, which I might mention if we have time at the end of the slot, but if not, we can come back to a discussion what they'll be in the report next month. But the focus for the next few minutes are the 4 case studies which you have mentioned. And those are to try to answer those questions that we were posed of what could 20-minute neighbourhoods look like in the Highlands and Islands. And to get, the first thing we worked out was what basis are we going to use to get to produce those case studies. So you'll all be aware of things like the place standard and the place and well-being outcomes that build on the place standard, and there are lots of wheels, diagrams, models produced in a similar vein. There's one in the TCPA report as well. They're all great, but none of them refer specifically to the Highlands and Islands, and none of them are, well, very few of them are specifically about 20-minute neighbourhoods. So we went back to square one, basically, and we, based on our own experience, doing things like community action plans in various bits of the Highlands and Islands, and talking to people in local authorities and other organisations in the Highlands and Islands, we produced yet another diagram of circles, but this is particularly focused on rural areas, and it's particularly thinking about rural daily needs that you might expect to get within 20 minutes. Now, I'm not sure if you can read the detail on the screen there. Anyway, it doesn't matter too much. But what it covers is not just things like travel facilities and getting about, important though they are, and those are covered in that green box there, things like walking and cycling routes and all those things that Stuart and Anne have been talking about. But as Stuart said, this isn't just about getting about, it's also about, do people have the healthcare and the services that they need, including access to fresh fruit and veg? Do people have access to housing that's affordable and that's good quality? Do people have access to jobs and work? And that a lot of that is around removing barriers to work, like having childcare, which is particularly an issue in rural areas. Do people have access to learning? So primary and secondary school, obviously, but also lifelong learning. Do people have all the aspects of community life that they need? Somewhere indoors to meet and do things, outdoor places to meet, do things, enjoy nature. So those are all part of rural daily needs. And then encompassing all that is a thing about resources, which underpins a lot of what Stuart and Anne were saying about not just financial resources, but capacity to deliver all this stuff. So what I'll do, before I go into the 4 case studies, which I'll do quite quickly, is I'll just quickly unpack those 6 or 7 components, features, if you like, of rural daily needs, because that's what we conceived of as the features of rural 20-minute neighbourhoods. They may not be so applicable in urban areas, but but indeed they may be. That wasn't really our focus. It was more on the Highlands and Islands. And you can see on the screen there, if you can read that, I don't know, sorry if it's a bit small, but within those 7 areas, that's the kind of level of detail that we were looking at to expect to find in a rural 20-minute neighbourhood. Now, I can talk about that in more detail during the Q&A if we need to, but it'll all be unpacked with examples of each one of those that already exists across the Highlands and Islands. So to take one example, the importance of a community hub really struck me as we were doing this research. So, for example, at the time of the Millennium funding, there were lots of village halls were refurbished and built around rural Scotland. A lot of those, you don't see much activity in them for most of the week, but some of those are really active and they have lots of things happening. So they've become a multi-purpose indoor space that they use for events, they use for entertainment, it could be music, clubs, whatever, it could be the cinema. They might have a co-working space in where folk who work from home locally can come and share facilities. Things like have access to decent broadband or printing facilities, 3D printing, whatever. They might be used for faith, for church services, that kind of thing. They could have a childcare facility in them. They could have mobile services like a hairdresser or a gym. There could be a library outpost. So that community hub, if it's programmed and it's active, which needs resources, it needs capacity to do that, but that hub can be so much more than just a hall that's used for badminton once a week. It can be a real hive of activity where lots of things happen. And then so that's just one example, and there are good examples of hubs around the Highlands that do that. And when you see the report next month, then you'll see links and examples of all of these things that are listed on the screen there, really to prove that a lot of all of the features of 20-minute hubs in the Highlands and Islands already exist. They need to be brought together and mainstreamed and implemented all across the piece, but they all exist already. This is nothing new, it's pulling things together. So that was our starting point to produce the key features of rural daily living, or 20-minute neighbourhoods. And then that enabled us then to apply those key features and see how they would land across the 4 case studies, which I'm going to just touch on very briefly. For each of the case studies, we've done a similar thing. So we've produced 20-minute walking catchment areas for cycling and for driving, which you can see on the screen from left to right there. There's a great online resource, which some of you may already know, called app.traveltime.com, where you can drop in a location, just like you do on Google Maps, and it will work out the 20-minute catchments for those 3 forms of transport. It does public transport as well, but it's a bit trickier to use. But this is a great resource. And when we were working with the planners in Orkney on doing the Doomby work here, they said, this is brilliant. We could use, I mean, it's not us, so I should say, this is all based on data from traveltime.com, but they immediately saw we could use this to build up series of 20-minute neighborhoods around Orkney mainland, which then feed up into the LDP. So they were thinking this is the basis of a future LDP, built up from a series of 20-minute neighborhoods, and using local place plans to build up each of those 20-minute neighborhood plans. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression, but I thought it was a very interesting insight from the planners in Orkney. So, so Doomby is a small village, about 200 people in northwest mainland. It's sort of, I don't know how many of you know Orkney, but there's Kirkwall and there's Stromness. So those are the 2 main towns. Doomby serves a wider hinterland up in the northwest of mainland there. It's about half an hour to get into, well, it's about 20 minutes to get to Stromness, about half an hour into Kirkwall. So and you can see that from the screen there. So those headings on that table there, those are the same headings that you saw earlier on of the key features of 20-minute neighborhoods. And what we've done is we've just said, these are the different things that would need to happen to make it happen in Doomby. So, for example, going back to Community Hub, which is the one I discussed earlier, there is a school in Doonby, which effectively functions as the Community Hub. There's also a fairly new church hall, which is used for other things apart from religious services as well. And there's a hotel, which is used as a meeting point. Now, those three buildings kind of work together as the community hub, but what the council's interested in doing is rebuilding the school and having more community facilities in it. So those three buildings would work together as the community hub for the village. And you can see on the table there's a lot of detail there about the other things that need to happen for the Doonby case study to become real, if you like. And then we've mapped those out both at the rural hinterland of Doonby. It's within 20 minutes drive of Doonby. There are lots of smaller farms, but there are also 4 smaller villages as well. So they could be linked through improved active travel routes. At the moment, you have to walk or cycle on de-restricted rural roads if you want to get between these places, not very conducive to walking and cycling. So those links could be improved. There could be a community transport initiative there, which has already been discussed actually, around having an e-bike, an e-bike program, which would have stations in each of the 4 or 5 villages, so people can move around by bike as well, provided that it's safer to do so. And there's a lot of interest in doing that through a local place plan that's starting there just now. So that's the wider area. And then we've done a plan for Doonby itself that looks at where all these things would land within the village, and also which reconfigures the current LDP to bring in the housing sites closer into the village centre, into the crossroads at the heart of the village, rather than at the moment they're a bit more dispersed and a bit further out. So to try and make it a bit more of a walkable neighbourhood. So that's a Doonby example. And it's feeding into a local place plan that's being done there just now as just one scenario for how Doonby could be in the future. Second one, very different scale, is looking at Alwaer. Those are the catchments for walking and cycling and driving. We're zooming out to a bigger scale here. So it's, as you can see, I hope from this plan here, Alwaer is composed of a number of smaller villages. There's 2 slightly larger ones at Beaumore and Port Ellen to the south. And each of these villages has some facilities like a school or a community hall or a shop. It's different in each place. So this is more looking at I guess an island-wide approach, how those settlements could work together so that people can access facilities in different ones. They're almost all within 20 minutes cycle of each other. They are all within 20 minutes drive of each other. Public transport's a different question, obviously, which we can come back to in the questions if we want to. Done a similar process there of working out what needs to happen to create the 20-minute neighbourhoods concept in Alwaer, and then a plan similar to the Doonby one, but zoomed out of what of the key features and how they would land in each settlement. Then on to the Alwaer one, which is different again. Alwaer is a larger settlement, about 1,500 people, and it functions as the service centre for a large area of the Northwest Highlands. In a way, there's not very much within walking or cycling distance of Alwaer, really, apart from very, very small places and isolated houses. So it's very different from the Alwaer and the Doonby case studies. What it is, in some ways, is actually it's already very close to a 20-minute neighbourhood within the main village itself. It's very walkable. Obviously, there's tweaks and improvements can be made, but it actually functions pretty close to a 20-minute neighbourhood already, with just a few things that need to happen. Primarily, there's a kind of suburb, if you like, about 20 minutes walk to the south on the Inverness Road, which isn't very well connected. So one of the main things there will be to improve the walking and cycling connections from that area up to the main village. So that's a slightly different model, if you like, slightly different typology. And then the final one is south of Loch Ness, about 30 to 45 minutes drive time or bus journey south of Inverness, is Foyers and Stratherick, which in some ways it's a bit similar, I guess, to Isla, in that there are 6 small settlements, total population of about 800. From north to south, as you can see on the right-hand map, it's around 20 minutes drive time linking up all these settlements from north to south. Different settlements have different things. So, for example, White Bridge in the south here has a community centre. Foyers in the centre has a GP surgery, and it has the only shop in the area. There's a school in Gorthlek. So each village has different things, and really they function effectively as one community, and people are very used to travelling between each of the communities to access different services and facilities, and of course going to Inverness for sort of larger scale things, or to go to secondary school, or for the supermarket shop once a week, that kind of thing. So we've done a similar process there, mapping what needs to happen, some notional costs against it, and producing a plan showing how the 20-minute neighbourhood might work. And one of the key things here is actually making sure that each village has a community hub of some sort. Most of them do, but they don't all yet. So the Community Development Trust that covers the area is starting work on building a community hub in a converted church up in Errigy there at the moment, and that's work that's ongoing, and considering one to start in Harrogate as well. So they're already working on these things, and they're also looking at how can they improve walking and cycling links within the villages, because they're pretty bad at the moment, except Foyers. People just walk straight out of their house onto a de-restricted road quite often. So the chance of kids walking or cycling to school is 0, because they're straight onto a road without a footway. But also between the settlements, there's a network of forest, effectively haulage roads, which almost link all these settlements up. So the Community Development Trust is looking at how can those become the basis of an off-road network which is safe to walk and cycle. So those are the 4 case studies. Very happy to talk about how we did them in a bit more detail. And in case anyone's interested, we've got information here about the suggested adjustments to draft MPF 4 from a Highlands and Islands perspective, and also the challenges about delivering all this stuff for a Highlands and Islands point of view as well, which effectively touch on a lot of the things which Stuart and Anne were saying earlier on. So I shall stop there, and I'll stop showing my screen as well, but very happy to answer any questions from you and or from others. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nick. So if people have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We can either bring you in or I can ask them on your behalf. I think actually, Nick, your last example there of the Foyers was a particularly interesting one, because I think that's one of the things that's come up a lot with other non-city or town-based groups that we've met with. And it's that issue of being able to have various services provided in a series of communities so that they all have something, rather than the fear which was expressed at our last meeting by Artemis around one settlement being chosen. And all the services going to that and everywhere else just now. So that was a particularly interesting one. The question I wanted to ask you actually was about your approach to Doonby, in suggesting that when people think of rural housing, people often think of moving to a rural area and living in a house that's not next to something else, or they maybe want to live in the centre or next to a pub. But it sounds like in Doonby there were housing allocations that were outside the settlement centre, and you're recommending they come in, which to me is the traditional way that our settlements have all developed. They've become denser. And I wondered how that recommendation had landed locally with people in Doonby.
Don't really know yet. For me, this has been a very interesting bit of work, because I'm in the very unusual situation of not doing any community engagement on the ground to produce these plans. So they're produced with varying amounts of engagement with the local authorities and with groups. And there was quite a bit on the Doonby one. The most was on the Doonby one, but we haven't tested them with the community yet. So how that plan is going to be used is in the local place planning process that's going to be more public over the summer, is they will use that plan probably, or layers of it, because you can break it down into each of each of the key features, they'll use it to stimulate debate. So what will be very interesting to see is, at the moment, I guess in response to demand there is a thing on Orkney, as in many rural areas, that people would rather have their plot, quite often a self-built plot, and as you said, it's got a bit of space around it. Whereas what that's doing in Doomby is it's leaving bits of field right by that crossroads, for example, bits of quite open land, which are creating gaps between, for example, the shop and the post office and the primary school, or most of the houses in the primary school. And it can be pretty windy, pretty blowy. That's not a very nice walk. So it's as much about consolidating the settlement to use up some of those smaller bits of land. We don't know how that will land yet, but we're hoping that if we can match that plan to stimulate discussion with what we know from work that's been done, from engagement we've done with the community council, with others over the last few months, we know that they're all very keen on more walking and cycling and more routes. So if we make the connection for them between, you want better walking and cycling, you want to be able to do that more, one way of doing that is to bring the settlement in. You need more houses, which you know anyway. So we're hoping to kind of make that connection, which I'm sure they will get straight away. Whether they agree is another thing, but my hunch is they're a pretty switched on bunch, so I think they'll get it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the same question arises around city development, where people are expecting semis or detached houses in the suburbs. Does that continue to be an option from an environmental perspective? And are we reducing the options of how we live? I think from an environmental perspective, yes, we should. But obviously, because we've lived through an age of choice being the most important thing, I imagine there'll be a rub there, which will be interesting to see how that lands. One of the questions that come in, so there's a couple of questions come in. Peter Node has said he likes the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods, or communities rather than neighbourhoods, sorry. And he's asking, was there much support for this with participants? And I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on that in the chat within this room, if you think 20-minute neighbourhoods is something that would land better. And before I ask you to speak a bit more about that, Nick, I suppose one of the interesting things about this is, I'm just reading Gillian Martin, the MSP's comments in the parliamentary debate on 20-minute neighbourhoods, and she quotes Matt Lowther from Public Health Scotland saying, we should not get too hung up on the 20-minute aspect. And we're now saying maybe we shouldn't get hung up on the neighbourhood aspect. So I wondered, in your sort of, I think we've talked about this already, Nick. Is it wordplay, or do you think it's meaningful in the people that you've talked to?
The word communities came out from discussion with people. We haven't tested it yet. My hope is that it's, to be blunt, it's quite an easy change for the government to make, and it would make it much more acceptable, make the concept much more acceptable for large swathes of the country who are concerned about it. So I would hope it will fall on, it'll fall on positive ears, but we haven't tested it yet. So I mean, it would be great to do a poll actually of the people who are here today to find out what you all think about it.
Well, again, if any people think this is a good idea or a bad idea, put it in the chat, because it is an interesting question. Because 20-minute neighbourhood policy has been flagshipped in manifestos for government, it will remain important. As we'll come on to a bit with Husam later, there's issues around how I think it's delivered in cities that are missing, but making it acceptable and palatable for the whole of Scotland. And I think Rambo said at the beginning of all this, Scotland was the only place that was trying to do it nationally. Everywhere else was doing it on a city basis, and Scotland was trying to deliver the concept nationally. So it would be interesting to see how that lands. The other question that's come in is from Judy Wilkinson around, you've not really mentioned growing spaces in the work that you've done with those communities. And I wondered if there was, as she makes the point, rural communities. I know Stuart Gazinski, who's in this meeting, I think he's in the call. I know that they're looking at that in Lomond and the Trossachs. And I wondered if you had any comments on growing spaces, Nick.
Well, Stuart is probably much better placed than me to talk about that because of the work they've been doing in Drimmen. There's a pilot going on there, and Stuart's been leading that. It's not missed out deliberately. It's that basically we were wanting to that rather than focus on one particular agenda, we were wanting to make sure that we cover the breadth of all facilities and services required. So although I haven't mentioned community growing spaces, it would definitely be something which would fall within the idea of having access to outdoor space and play parks and all those kinds of things as being very important. I get, and that's not to diminish community growing spaces at all, that they're just as important in rural areas as they are in urban areas. I wanted to make sure that in this bit of work, we didn't go down, we didn't follow specific agendas which appeared then to exclude other things. So it's as simple as that, really.
Okay, thanks very much, Nick. It's 20 past, we're going to break for coffee, but Nick, there's some comments in the chat around people are saying that they think communities would land better, so an acknowledgement that the 20 minutes is a barrier, certainly for some people within rural Scotland, but also if we're including sort of driving, does that undermine the whole concept, or is it that we accept that driving, there may be future sustainable approaches to driving, which we may hear about later on this morning from you, Mark. But I would like to thank you, Nick, and we will pause just now and everybody have a comfort break, grab a coffee. See you in a minute. Looks like we have mixed opinions on communities versus neighbourhood. Some people in favour, some people preferring neighbourhood, some people already using communities and finding it's working well. In Mabel from Duncan Clellan. So interesting to see where this goes. One of the things I should stress is that most of the responses to 20-minute neighbourhoods in a parliamentary sense are saying they like the idea and they want more detail. And the response obviously we had at our last session was in rural Scotland, they thought it was a very good idea for cities. So there's a sort of recognition around it for cities and towns as being something that's good. But the one thing that I would say nobody from the parliamentary aspect did in their responses was a major thing that I think is important around it in a city context. And Stuart picked up on it earlier when he was talking about what we need in a retail sense, and retail requires a quantity of people. It requires density. And in a lot of the other international investigation on 20-minute neighbourhoods, density is a strong feature. RTPI, I think, have said they're recommending 60 households per hectare as part of their recommendation for 20-minute neighbourhoods, which is why when it comes to rural area, there's maybe something different to be discussed. But on that point, I'm going to invite Husam Alwaer from the University of Dundee. He's been doing a lot of research, and this may just be a taster of the research that Husam has been doing over the past 3 years. But we only have a short space of time, so he can't share all the information he's been doing recently. But he is going to speak to us this morning on density, intensity, and proximity. So over to you, Husam.
Thank you. Can you see the slide? And
can indeed. It's all clear and we can hear you.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the invite. I will give just really kind of headlines and some snapshots, and I promised you, my colleague, we will do maybe a more detailed talk at some point in the near future. So I am based in Dundee University. The talk today is really, if I may say yes, although I have an academic hat, but this is based on my ongoing discussion with my colleagues in the Academy of Urbanism, Kevin Murray Associate, Proctor Matthew Architect. So it's really bringing as well my linkage and my work with some colleague in Scandinavian countries and Europe. So we'll share something between national and international perspective, including the ongoing work based on my civic urban lab with both Dundee City Council and Perth City Council, and recently with Damascus in Syria. So now, why we need, I think to me, when it's come to word density, it's very important. We need to answer these questions. Why we need to explain compact or gentle density can be really aspirational rather than people may perceive it, oh, it is about crowdness, or it is about the, interfering with privacy. A lot of research show that compact mixed use reduce the needs for transport by vehicles, but equally support really more vibrant and vital sustainable neighborhoods. Now, at the heart of 20 minutes neighborhood, living, working and playing and enjoying locally. But we need to appreciate that distance and the distances we created over the last 30 or 40 years does require and demand transportation, Density and gentle density is not new. This is, if you look at Atlanta versus Barcelona, both areas, both cities, they accommodate nearly 5 million people. Atlanta cover nearly 7,700 kilometers square, heavily based on it's car-centric cities. Barcelona, based on gentle density, 3 up to 4 floors, only cover 650 kilometers square. But wow, look at the transport carbon emissions per capita. In Atlanta is about 7 tons. In Barcelona is only nearly 1.1 tons. So no brainer, we need to really start thinking about gentle densities, I call it, but in a very aspirational way. And we need to bring local authority, not only local authorities, private sectors about this. It's not enough. It's no longer acceptable just to deliver 20 units or 20 dwellings per hectare. by the way, in Scotland is about 20, 25, in England, about 30 in suburbia. We need to start moving into 45 and 50 and 60. But this is not only about thinking about numbers, this is about the place. Of course, there is no hard and fast rules on how to deal with density. There is different definitions, even interestingly, between architects, planners, local authorities, private sectors. They are mixed view on how they perceive and how they define density and what density entails. In a spatial sense, most of the time we define it in terms of number of units in a given area. Why density is important? Because the way we use density, we use it to describe, predict, sometimes control, and it's merely to control the use of land. However, what is important, people perceive the perceptions of density, whether it is high or low, by the way, in any context, can influence how they behave, how they respond emotionally, or even in terms of health or well-being, or even to others. So density is really, to me, is not about only numbers. It's about place. And most of the time, density really, it will affect how we behave, whether we walk, whether we use car or so. So it has important impact on things to do with the really quality of life, mental and physical well-being. But what is important, what might be low density for some, it could be high for others. And place, this is to me, is really about place and require place solutions. Now, this is now to me quite really very important slide after a lot of discussions. How do we measure and assess density? In general sense, the first one being used a lot in the UK, the number of units or dwellings per hectare. That's called density. Having said that, my colleagues, you cannot talk about density in isolation from intensity of occupations. Who live there? How many? What? And their range and demography. So as well, we need to correlate the number of people per hectare with the density. Equally, how much we spend per hectare, the capital expenditure now becoming to me is really fundamental. If you look at when you deliver 20 units per hectare or 25, just look on how much money we spend on the infrastructure itself per person per hectare. I think we need to start correlating this if we are serious about delivering better value socially, economically, and environmentally. Unfortunately, as you can see, the urban fabric has changed and evolved. The urban fabric the urban structure used to be comprised block, plot, and streets. It's an intertwined things. This is unfortunately no longer the case. We no longer really, how do you want me to say, we take on board the generic structure in urban form in a way of how we shape our towns or villages or neighborhoods. And not necessarily the evolution is always as a positive. Things, especially things becoming larger, bigger. With the road, we created all those massive distances. We need to start thinking about these connections rather than disconnections. This is what we've been delivering for the last 30 or 4 years. This is what the volume house builders, the typical housing development we do in the UK and in Scotland. But what a shame. I did simple calculation. If you look at those 4 neighborhoods, it's really not fair even to call them neighborhoods. Those are volume house builders. They comprise 40%, nearly 40% roads and parkings. So imagine the structure, 40% goes into road and parking, 10% pavement disconnected, and the majority are pavement for parking again, 27% private gardens, 23% building footprint, 0 ATM, 0 dentist, 0 corner shops, 0 facilities, 0 services. No brainer why we should use the car then. And we created this, what I call it, the advantage of neighborliness is really being lost. The danger with this kind of model, when you have low density, you have no incentive to invest whatsoever. If you don't have enough people, if I may say, You cannot justify having any kind of facilities or services, whether in suburban area or in rural area, let alone issue of the poor accessibility, the social isolation, the congestions, and really massive decline in public health. This is one of the neighborhood, an existing one in Dundee. It's called Whittle. I'm sure you know Whittle. In the history, it was an initiative by the Scottish government. The problem with those little bucket of houses, because they don't relate it to a macro, what I call it, place pictures, and they are in isolation from each other. I could tell you, after a lot of consideration, they make the 20 minutes neighborhood impossible, really impossible. The way we shape the plot, the logs around that cul-de-sacs, make the connectivity and permeability really impossible. Unless we have to have a major investment to make the connectivity an option. And I doubt it, because some of those pockets now is only 2 or 3 years old. And unfortunately, those will last at least 40, 50 years from now. So yes, streets, we need to start thinking about streets, but we need to be as well realistic whether 20 minutes neighborhood can be implemented or not, especially for the existing one. So yes, I agree with the comments about retrofitting is not going to be a straightforward. Another things, to me, we need to start thinking really carefully about how do we make better use of land and allows what I call it more to be set aside for nature and biodiversity. I really do. I like the Scandinavian, recently, the Scandinavian countries, especially Denmark, taking this idea. How do we make most of the land, especially in rural and suburban area, by really having more gentle density, increasing the density, but having reduction in the land use, and wow, embracing and bringing nature and green and giving more power to the shared spaces and public spaces, but also having more reduction in the environmental impact. However, people always feel afraid from this kind of solution. Why? Because they feel privacy is an issue. People think that higher density may have impact on this privacy. I am not saying this is the most interesting solution I ever seen, because people may fear about how the block, if I may say, meet the ground and meet the street, especially issue of diversity. But we need to diversify our system. We really need to diversify our system. This is another interesting Scandinavian issues in solutions in Aarhus, where as well in urban area, they try to really embrace green and nature within those blocks and giving more power to the spaces in between, especially the shared and public spaces, which really should encourage cycling, walkability over car. But this is not new for us. We should be proud of some of our historical villages. This is Brotiferi. To me, it is an exemplar, a true example of 10 minutes neighborhood. This is a neighborhood where it has everything you need. It's really self-contained, from dentists to doctor to accountants, architects, light industry, cycling, walkability, train station. What is the density range? The rule of thumbs. The low density is between 15 and 30. We need to start really visiting the mid density and maybe a bit higher density. But this should be what I call it place specific. This is fantastic slide I came across from Jan Gale office. He did fantastic studies bringing the average size of households in 1900 in Copenhagen, in the old city, versus the new city area, again dense in 2000, versus 2 suburban one. See how we move from, in Copenhagen, which is similar, by the way, to some of the old towns and city here in Scotland. 4 people, average of 4 people. For 4 people, you need, we used to have 475 dwelling per hectare. Wow, when you look at what we do now in Copenhagen, in suburbia, now the average is only 2, and you have 80 dwellings per hectare. Or 21. That's really very low. That's very low. Number of residents per hectare used to be in the old city of Copenhagen, 2,000. Now it is about 4270. So we really need to start correlating the two, the average size of households, but also the number of residents per hectare, and also the length of road per hectare, which is to me the cost associated with how many meters we provide per hectare per person between dense area and not dense area. I think we really need to start correlating those things together. Average size of a dwelling used to be 10 meters square per person, by the way. Now it is about 60. Me and my students, we've done working in a life project with bears. I am just going to show you an interesting study in Bears City. So this is Bears City in 1860. It used to have 30,000 people only. In 1900, again, a bit stayed the same, but with more growth in the outer, and suburbia start emerging. In 1930, only 35,000 people, but as you can see, massive suburban growth. What it shows how compact, and maybe it used to be crowded, if I may say, 6 or 7 people per households. So that's the size. I don't have that. I do have the data now, 2020. Wow, 47,000 only now. So imagine within 150 years, we added only 17,000 people, but look at the sprawl we created. The average household size, you will be surprised, nearly 2. So we moved down from 7 to 4, and now only the average household in Bears and suburbia is 2. And in Bears, we are expecting 25% more to live by 2030. So where are we going to accommodate those? Are we going to build more suburbia and sprawl, or are we going to densify what we have? This is the study, by the way, for Bears. Happy to share it with you all, guys. Just some really basic principles I came across. We need to start really plan higher density and uses around transportation. But this has to be linked, has to correlate public transportation with diversity and density. And this is not new, as Richard Rogers proposed in this lovely drawings. He tried to argue that we should, if we think about density, we should intensify the uses and activities alongside main integrated transport system, but we should as well be able to provide good facilities without losing the access to green, blue, and nature and biodiversity. So this is, to me, is really about establishing a massing strategy that supports spatial hierarchy. So the scale and intensity of buildings or housing unit and dwellings should reflect the importance of shared spaces and streets within really a spatial framework, which must enable walkability, cycling, and encourage active travel. So this is really about creating healthier neighborhood. Of course, there is a different mode and different models how you could deliver density, if I may say. But the questions to us here, we must think about how can we accommodate for density, but also diversity. So not everything looks the same. Not everything's looking the same. And there is an attempt now in London and elsewhere to start really thinking about how do we transform suburbia. But gentle density should as well promote the mixed tenure housing for a wide demography, a cross section, but to be tenure blind in architectural resources solutions. But equally, density could really play a big role in terms of creating a sense of enclosure, safety, and protection, and should really design to nurture social interaction. So, and also it should really help us, the density. I will show an examples how we put really people first rather than car. Also, we should move away from this, always we deliver these units, we call them units, and they look like boxes. They should be really integrated part of how we deliver neighborhood design. This requires a coherent spatial framework, which cannot be really designed in isolation from the way we do urban design and urbanism. Hence, now there is a real attempt by velocity placemaking that what kind of typologies, if we are serious about this idea of living, working, enjoying, and really mixing of all, what kind of typologies we should provide in suburbia and in rural areas. So this kind of idea of diversifying everything is really key. One of the greater examples I ever seen myself, and I strongly recommend you visited Greater Newton in Cambridgeshire area. The density was 46 hectares, 40% is social and affordable housing. One thing that's stunning I found about it, if I may say, the way they use nature and they embrace nature as and share the spaces to inform the quality of the built form and the density itself. And also the way they manage to hide, most of the cars are being hide. They are part of integrated part of the built form. So you don't see the car in the streets. The car are inside the built form itself. But also the Greenwich Millennium Village, where the density here reach up to 74 as well. But equally as well, the spaces in between buildings is for interactions and bringing society together as well, and encouraging active travel. So density is really not a bad thing, could be really very aspirational things. So this is just some of the examples. And I would like to finish off with this something very aspirational through my engagement with the mayor office in Utrecht. They proposed recently Utrecht barcode, the Utrecht barcode, bringing all the disciplines in Utrecht cities in order to create a 10 minutes neighborhood by 2040. So they have everything from underground, on the ground, and above the ground, everything to do with density, housing, foundation, waste, electricity, water, cycling. And why not we have our own bespoke version for rural area, suburban area, and urban area. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Husam. That was excellent. You were more than 15 minutes, but I let you go on because we were having positive comments in the chat. They were really good examples, and it was exactly what I wanted people to be thinking about, particularly in relation to NPF4. And I think you have picked up on things that Stuart talked about at the beginning, which is around us making things happen. We are currently allowing things to happen, and we're not forcing the density issue. And the compact, gentle density, there's references to compact settlements in the chat. You really well illustrated that, and obviously there's some questions as to, why are we not doing this here? Because it looks like it's even in an economic interest, a good use of land from a development perspective. And maybe I think Nicola Barclay is standing down from Homes for Scotland. Maybe we will invite whoever becomes the new director for Homes for Scotland to come and talk to us as to why they think that their members don't really deliver this sort of thing. I won't take any questions for you at this point in time. There might be at the end, and we will bring Sam back to this to look at some of these issues in a bit more detail. So thank you very much for that, Husam. Transport has come up in a lot of the discussion, and so on that point, we are going to look at mobility hubs in a 20-minute context, and Mark Dowie is going to do that from Como UK. So Mark, share your screen and tell us all about mobility hubs.
Thanks very much for that, Ewan. I hope everybody can see the screen. I'll get into presenter mode.
Yep, that's fine.
2 seconds, I'll move that out of the way. Yeah, thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here. My name is Mark Dowie. I'm the Development Officer for Como UK in Scotland, specialising in the built environment. We at Como, we advocate for all forms of shared transport. I'm here today primarily to talk to you about the relevance of shared transport to 20-minute neighbourhood solutions. I'm sure everyone is delighted to have NPF4 consultation process in the rearview mirror. However, the issue of 20-minute neighbourhoods is still a very live one, and remains the focus of today's conference, and rightly so. Today I would like to cover shared transport solutions in the context of this new urban journey. If I can change my slide. Oh, jumped one. As a quick refresher, I'm sure you've seen some presentations from me before, but shared transport covers the following modes. Covers bike share, including e-bike share, lift share in car clubs, e-scooter share, which is a bit of a hot topic at the moment. It's not here in Scotland, but it's been discussed a lot in England and is out for trials in England. EV charging in the context of car clubs, EV car clubs, and DDRT, digital demand responsive transport, perhaps more in a rural context. All these tend to exist at public transport nodes, such as train stations and bus stops. Public transport interconnectivity is vital to ensure that first and last mile journeys are car-free. It's also worth mentioning mobility hubs. This is where we bring all these modes together to offer modal shift and modal choice to users. So moving on, let's pause to remember where we are in this climate crisis. As you can see from this graph from the IFG, there's a downward trend generally on most sectors' emissions, with the exception of transport, which is absolutely flatlining. Transport's the blue there, if you can see that on the screen. There's been wonderful progress on energy supply, primarily getting rid of coal power stations. And business and residential emissions are starting to show a downward trend. Transport, however, is going nowhere fast. And I think it's fair to say that anecdotally, little has changed in terms of how we move around Scotland compared to, say, the last 20 years. It's up to all of us to start thinking about how developments, neighbourhoods, local development plans, everything else that goes into the built environment process affects the transport choices that we make. The planning trap. So we're currently in a position where shared transport sits between the two planning camps, development and transport. If there's one takeaway from this presentation, it is that development planning needs to start addressing the transport planning gap in its delivery processes, and that transport planning needs to cease being standalone in some instances or completely subservient to development planning. There needs to be a joined up, cohesive understanding of how the two interact and influence each other. So in terms of NPF4, our consultation responses focused on the following. Designed in when planning new developments of the country's future net zero goals are to be met. Como UK is calling for clear and robust support from mobility hubs, and I'm delighted to say that mobility hubs are in STPR2, and we'll touch on that briefly at the end. NPF4 seizes the opportunity to create a shift towards low car, no car neighbourhoods by recommending that planning authorities support low car neighbourhoods, define the development characteristics of low car neighbourhoods, and require all developments to build flexibility to allow them to become low car neighbourhoods in future. Transport considerations need to be properly built into the planning system, not bolted on. The reality is that NPF4 falls short in many policy areas. NPF4 compares unfavourably to both STPR2 and 20% car kilometre reduction in terms of bringing shared transport into the planning mix. So if we looked at the policy landscape, what a 20-minute neighbourhood, and what is a 20-minute neighbourhood in a shared transport context? Well, simply put, we view it as a huge opportunity. 20-minute neighbourhoods are fundamentally about how we move around sustainably. Shared transport provides us with a real carbon solution. Let's face it, we currently don't have too many tools to address the climate change challenges we face. Well, that's an easy one to say. And this is relatively low-hanging fruit compared to some other options. Also, it ticks a lot of other adjacent policy concerns, such as poverty and health. Simply put, not everyone wants to own a bike or own a car or walk. Another big example is the sharing economy. We have a demographical change here. Spotify, Netflix, etc., all part of the sharing economy that is becoming more prevalent amongst our young people, and shared transport very much adds into that. Lastly, it promotes modal shift. All our research around bike share and car clubs suggests shared transport is a great facilitator in getting people out of the car and thinking about alternative modes to make their journey. It makes them think about other ways of doing this. It's not just about the private car. To successfully transition away from private car use and adopt other modes of transport as the primary source of our travel responses, we need to engage with bus and train operators on shared transport. And to that end, we've got a new position coming into post that will do just that with the new Scottish Railways. It's just been nationalised. First and last mile solutions, it promotes public transport usage. If you've got the ability to get to a train station or a bus station easily and simply, then you'll do so and you'll leave the car at home. That therefore increases the use on public transport. So it's a chicken and egg situation. Transport interchanges, particularly train stations, are ideal locations for mobility hubs. So bring all these modes together, give people the option to use them. And I think local authority buy-in is hugely key in a planning context. We really need these local authorities to engage and understand what mobility hubs are, what shared transport is, and utilise it in the communities. Because at the end of the day, this is about removing private car use for very good reasons. And if the local authorities are not there promoting it, and some are and are very prevalent in Scotland, we'll touch on that in a moment, then, you know, private developers, housing associations are less likely to engage. Somebody needs to step up to the plate and be the first man at the post. And lastly, the car is not king. We do not need to make it so. And we need to think outside the box, but we need to do it in a way that delivers alternative solutions. And that's where we're saying shared transport. It's not about ownership, but it's about availability. On the development planning side, there are a number of actions that can help us move forward. As I mentioned before, engaged. The built environment community need to view shared transport as a viable transport solution. When we get down to things like suburbia, we're talking about parking ratios. Less cars equals more houses. We can look at things like parking barns, which are done across Europe now. I mean, I've done simple back of fag packet calcs, and as soon as you reduce the number of car parking spaces in a development, the density by unit can increase by around 30%. A car parking space is circa 20 metres squared if you take into account the bit of road that makes it viable, or 27% of a 75 metre squared apartment. A car parking space is huge. So if you're providing 2 of them per apartment, you're really taking up an enormous amount of land. It's very similar to what Husam just was talking about. Design quality and amenity. It adds function and amenity, engaging with the place principle process. Shared transport is an amenity. It allows people to move around in a cheap and reasonable manner. And I'll touch upon that with our architects exemplars we've recently commissioned. Development planning, again, why not about a Section 75 engagement, providing more infrastructure such as mobility hubs? There's no reason why not, but we're not seeing enough of that happening at the moment. And again, let's reiterate, the car is not king, and that's with specific reference to suburbia and the amount of car parking spaces that these developments actually deliver, and therefore knock all other forms of transport completely out the water. It's all about the amount of investment in car parking or in cars, and people not willing to go to other modes because they have the 2 cars sitting in the driveway. How am I doing for time? So in terms of new stuff coming forward, there's the Glasgow Transport Strategy published in 2022. This is its goals. I'll not read them all out. But if you go into them, they're less actually about transport and more about built environment. They're trying to actually improve the built environment by reducing and improving the way we move around. I think that's very important to highlight. Similarly, in Edinburgh, the new Edinburgh City Mobility Plan is broadly aligned with the Glasgow document. Shared transport is a key response in how City of Edinburgh Council intend to tackle climate change, air quality, transport poverty, to make the city a better place for all. 20-minute neighbourhoods and shared transport are a marriage made in heaven. I really hope that these two documents will be market leaders in driving forward a low-car, active and public transport solution across Scotland, and it puts shared transport right at the heart of the matter. There's also the regional transport partnerships are working towards a lot of these goals as well in terms of changing and altering transport modes. Hi-Trans are looking at e-bike sharing schemes, that's up and running, that's Go Bike up north, and EV car clubs, and Sestrans are delivering a very strong pilot scheme in St Andrews. So we're starting to see shared transport projects emerge across Scotland, not just in the Central Belt. We have briefly mentioned other policy instruments that are out there just now. A lot of us have been involved in responding to them. The STPR2, Strategic Transport Policy Review, it's got a strong mobility hubs policy. 20% car kilometre reduction is a hugely ambitious policy to reduce car journeys by 20% by 2030. And shared transport within that context, within that policy context, is seen as one of the main drivers of change and transport modal change. Well, the rural conundrum, I think we've touched on that a fair bit as part of this conference so far. We definitely see a challenge around 20-minute neighbourhoods and shared transport with reference to the work SURF and the Scottish Rural Action have been doing. We're working hard with partners to understand the best offering that meets the needs of rural communities, be it e-bikes, DDRT, EV car clubs. There are options out there for rural communities. We've just got to step up to the plate and understand them a bit better. And I think the obvious one is the challenge of linking the right shared transport offering with public transport in most of rural Scotland. That's absolutely huge, and it's the big issue and the live one out there just now. If I can drop into some case studies, just to give an example of some mobility hubs that are happening. We've got one in Redbridge down in London. This is a small mobility hub, so small is beautiful. It's about starting somewhere and increasing the network from there. To come nearer to home, the community up at Loch Ness at Drumnagdrochit have taken over a retail unit in a car park and have provided us with a Loch Ness travel hub, which is bikes and e-bikes, and I think they're looking at an EV car club. Last case study is in West Lothian at Calderwood. It's a huge new suburban development, and as part of their delivery, they decided to implement a mobility hub, which has an EV car club. It did have a bike scheme, but sadly that went as part of the Edinburgh bike scheme, but I believe that they're pursuing alternative suppliers for that. But again, they've thought about it and they're trying to deliver something within the context of that development. I should add that development across the board has 2 cars per house everywhere. So the viability of the mobility hub might well be challenged in the long term. As I mentioned, we've been working closely with John Gilbert Architects in Glasgow to start fleshing out our ideas for mobility hubs. They've designed 5 hubs across different urban typologies, from city centre to small tourist hub. The idea is to start to try and realise a vision that puts quality and placemaking at the centre of the mobility hub offering. We've also had them costed, but I won't spoil everybody's day quite yet, as we have some work to do there as to get the costings to somewhere we want to be. And we'll be publishing some guidance and stuff in that in due course. We'll let everybody know in our news feeds and such like. Won't go into too much depth here in terms of how we can help. There's a varieties of ways. In terms of this, we've got a lot of design guides on the website. Within the shared Transport Knowledge Centre, which I'll touch on in a minute. We also do some place standards work where we bring some shared transport questions into the place standards framework to allow communities to actually think about shared transport in a planning context, community planning context. And that's the Shared Transport Knowledge Centre there. Please do go and have a look at it. It's a wonderful resource if you're thinking about shared transport in a planning context, a community context, anything at all. It'll give you a lot of guidance in terms of how you deliver stuff like this. I think that's me. I'm hoping I'm around about 15 minutes. Ewan's not looking too
You're fine. No, I would never be grumpy, Mark.
I'm sure not. Thanks very much for your time, everyone. If you wish to contact me, please do so at mark@como.org.uk. We've got an enormous amount of guidance on the website around shared transport. And if you're not satisfied with that, or you need a chat, then please do give me a shout and we'll be happy to get in touch with you. We've also got loads and loads of case studies, which we touched on in the presentation, but happy to share those as well. And I think that's me. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. Mark, I just wanted to pick up on something. One of the things I do like is the fact, one of the things that helps me actually get my head around what you're actually trying to deliver at Como UK is the first and last mile strategy, which I totally get that. I think that's handily snappy. But I suppose one of the questions I think you raised around density was, why we're not getting the housing developers to do that. And I suppose from your perspective, you use Calderwood as an example. What sort of response are you getting from the development industry around them including this as part of the infrastructure of new housing?
Yeah, not a great response is probably the best way that I can put it. Housing associations are definitely interested. They can see a real win here around transport poverty, and also they can increase their offering to their tenants through things like shared transport and increase their density. So they see a lot of wins on it. I have engaged with Home for Scotland. We have joined as members. Unfortunately, my 2 blogs that went out there on this sort of topic met with very little response. Well, very little, I mean, absolutely hee-haw. So yeah, it's going to be an uphill struggle. But I think if there's pressure brought to bear on them from a number of sources, not just shared transport, we're a relatively small fish in this pond, then I think it's one of the things, it's one of the hooks that they will hopefully avail themselves of. But at the moment, yeah, not a great deal, unfortunately.
Okay, that's maybe unsurprising but interesting to know, because obviously a lot of the Scottish Government's ambition for delivery of 20-minute neighbourhoods is dependent highly on private sector participating well in this, whether or not it's around the shape of our places, but transport is obviously a key part to that. And obviously you touched on the fact that the connection with public transport is key, but there is obviously problems around that. Husam, you've put your hand up for a question.
Just to echo what you said, if I may say, you and my frustration, there is a lot of interesting talks, a lot of good debates in Scotland, but where is the private sector from this, if I may say? Especially as you highlighted, they are the people at the end of the day, like it or not, they will deliver it. And I keep saying a lot of projects here in Scotland, they have been given permission for really very low density, let alone the quality of placemaking and so on. So just this is what worries me. We debate, we have really very good, my goodness, a lot of fantastic insight into the subject matter, I could say, but private sectors, where are they? How do we bring them? How do we give them incentive to come in on board?
Yeah, I think it's I suppose in my previous job, it was always a challenge to involve the private sector in discussions at that as well. And it wasn't in their interest, currently because their business model works. So why change? And I think unless there is strong leadership or prescription that means they have to change their financial model, that's the reason that they will then begin to participate a bit more. But it does remain a challenge, and I agree that I think from what we're hearing this morning, it's a prescription is necessary in decision-making processes so that people have less wiggle room, which is maybe a challenge within our current system. But thank you very much, Mark. We're back on time. So sorry to cut Q&A a little bit short. I'm now going to hand over to Natalie Whittle, who I introduced at the beginning, probably in the biggest way, more than the other speakers, on the basis of the book that she had read. And I think in a lot of the conversation that we've had this morning, at the back of it, there's been a high recognition that individual behaviour is key to actually what a 15-minute city or a 20-minute neighbourhood or a 20-minute community or just a living well locally policy may look like. And so we've invited Natalie to join her reflections. I'd be interested to hear what she thinks of our discussion this morning, and then we'll have a broader Q&A at the end of Natalie's presentation. So thank you very much, Natalie, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ewan. Thank you for the invitation to speak. And as you mentioned, I am a layperson amongst an audience of experts. So you may hear what sound like sweeping statements from me, but I really want to look at the issue of public behaviour in the 15-minute city in the context of how it compares to lockdown, which was the environment that got me interested in this subject in the first place, the sort of the constraints of lockdown in a way sort of mirroring what the 15-minute city is trying to achieve, with obviously with the greatest degree of freedom. I'm going to try and share my screen so you just don't have to, with a placeholder slide, so you don't have to look at my mug for 30 minutes. Yes, so this is what is now a plaza in front of the Centre Pompidou in Paris, and I sometimes look at this image to remind myself that cities do change radically in quite short periods of time. So yeah, so I mean, whether or not you caught COVID-19 in the past 2 years, I mean, one thing that you almost certainly developed was a sort of definite and a new sense of place, because the boundaries in place made us de facto creatures of the neighbourhood, not through choice, but because we had nowhere else to go, as everyone knows. And unwittingly, we rehearsed this sort of simulation of what the 15-minute city ideal wants us to enact more permanently, which is, as I understand it, a capsule of urban life that is enriching and well organised enough to contain us without the regular need for displacement in fossil fuel vehicle. I'm often asked, you know, because I've written a book about the subject, to come up with a sort of one-liner, a description of what a 15-minute city or 20-minute neighbourhood is. I mean, how do you describe it to someone at the pub? I mean, I think, as all of the speakers have touched on, it's a very complex, multi-part sort of thing to actually pull off. And so once you start to unpick it, it does become quite difficult to define. But I think the illustration of lockdown behaviour sort of solved quite a few of those worries through its spontaneity. So in my home neighbourhood in the south side of Glasgow, which is sort of between Govan Hill and Strathbungo's slightly amorphous boundary, a miniature city could be said to have sort of self-seeded in half a square mile within the space of a few months. And nowhere was this more apparent than the park, which became this sort of multi-use venue. It became a bar, it became a nightclub, a gym, a bowling alley, a cafe, a reading room, a yoga studio, and a few other sort of more unmentionable things. And really sort of saw the city invert itself and contort and adapt. And, you know, what was really striking about this is sort of, may sound obvious to sort of recap this now, but I think quite quickly it's going to be easy enough to forget what this was like. But this was really, you know, really driven by people and not policy. So, you know, high in my mind has been how as much as the state restrictions were inflexible, the responses from the public were imaginative. And I suppose part of what I've been thinking about in speaking to you today is how we can really harness public imagination, public agency, and behaviour in order to drive the 15-minute city model, accelerate it beyond some of the obstacles which have been outlined so clearly by previous speakers. So thinking of all of the things that sort of came up and started to take place in the park, many of those functions have now returned to their sort of pre-pandemic places, and the park and definitely my neighbourhood are just not quite the same as they were. That's not the same mood, and I think that some vitality and some sense of communality has not vanished, but has slightly sort of dropped from the atmosphere in these realms. And so what I want to also consider today is whether some useful part of this pandemic-induced behaviour still translates now in our daily lives, and if it, could potentially continue to do so in the long term, and if not, why not? So first I'd like to look in a little bit in more detail at some of the things that sort of shifted in favour towards the 15-minute city ideal. We know about sort of the temporary uplift in bicycle use, in people buying bicycles, particularly in territories maybe where you wouldn't expect it. Thinking of America, where there was a massive boom in people buying bicycles, a sort of a spike that was unprecedented in the past 100 years. But looking at it in a different way, so one of the things that really came about was an appreciation and a reckoning with our immediate surroundings. I personally think that this is quite a big part of the 15-minute city puzzle, because we really need to know what people's sense is of their own resources and of their relationship with the neighbourhood in which they live, and what they find interesting or frustrating in a neighbourhood, in order for meaningful engagement and change to take place. So that may be sort of more work to be done on polling people about their abstract engagement within a neighbourhood, rather than their sort of more quantitative appreciation of, what can they access within certain distances and times. I think lockdown was also full of a slightly more obscured part of our relationship with the built environment, which is what the French situationists called the infraordinary, which is very pretentious sounding, probably pretentious in itself, but quite an interesting concept that observes a layer of material that sits somewhere between the extraordinary and the ordinary. So I think, there was lots of conversation about this, how you could suddenly notice the quality of the birdsong, or somebody put the name of the cat that was always staring at you from the window of a flat. They would say hello to Wallace or whatever it was. So these little kind of details came forward, and it was actually sort of an interesting process where we realised that yes, your neighbourhood is a place where you are every day, but how well did you really know it? And there've been, long before the pandemic, there've been people who've been thinking about this question through other lenses. So Milton Glaser, the sort of celebrated American designer of the I Love New York logo, once challenged his students to draw from memory a picture of their home. And this is a fascinating experiment, because his assumption that this exercise was going to be a lot harder than it sounds is absolutely correct. So we take far more than we realise for granted about the level of information and knowledge that we possess about the place we should know best, which is obviously the home on our doorstep. If you try Glazer's exercise, you know, if you took a piece of paper now and got out a pencil and tried to draw the outline of your home, you might find that you actually don't have that much detail. So to contrast some of the, you know, I think it's really interesting actually sort of to take away the word neighbourhood and replace it with community. Particularly if you think about some of the other interpretations of this way of modelling, you know, new models of urbanism. In Sweden, they call it the 1 minute city, which is asking very small groups of people living within a section of a street to think about what they would change in that environment that they can see from their doorstep, and maybe, you know, sometimes giving them resources to play with. I think what is, in a sense, admirable about that effect, that is sort of an acknowledgement that we are under time pressure because of the environmental crisis. But, you know, in some ways, maybe we need to start quite slowly, work street by street in order to get the best long-term results. And I think, you know, I think there's something to be said also for the adaptive effects of lockdown, showing that momentum can really build quite quickly. In the backcourt of the tenement where I live, one neighbour started to plant more greenery, and soon there was a kind of quite a competitive range of other neighbours who planted more, and sort of suddenly what was a very drab concrete space had become a garden, and it was a small sort of summer playground for the children. So again, I think some of these experiences of lockdown are important because they show how momentum can build from the grassroots up, but also, you know, can put us in touch with the reality of what a mature 15 or 20 minute neighbourhood might be like, which is driven by our emotional and psychological relationship with a place. And I think, I think it's important that the planning around a 50-minute city has consideration for this abstract side of the movement, with a view to sort of linking people's motivation to get behind the concept with their relative enjoyment or tolerance of living locally. There's a flip side to this. So I think that sometimes we need to forget, and sometimes we need to ignore things in order to get on with our lives. And we might need our homes to maintain their traditional role of an anonymous private retreat for this to work. You know, but perhaps we're all going a little bit mad in the 15-minute city. But I think, you know, so much of the conversation around this topic uses the shorthand of creating cities built for people, not cars. But where so often I found, you know, reading lots of papers about this, where so often it goes next, it is the argument progresses from here to sort of find ways that people can avoid using the car by traveling more safely, conveniently on foot or by bike. But the 15-minute city, as others have pointed out, it's not just a place of transport, and better transport doesn't equal a kind of necessarily a better place to live or a utopia. I think there isn't enough discussion around how people would actually feel in such a place. And as I mentioned in my book, there's been a bit of research conducted into the adverse effects of what is termed a lack of life space. A life space is a shorthand for your range of freedom and your confidence of movement through a place. Sorry, you might be able to hear my dog in the background. Life space understands that, you know, you need a rich variety of people encounters in order to keep your cognitive ability sharp. And for those already at risk of cognitive decline, a reduction in life space can accelerate decline. So, I mean, the researchers were able to show that people with early symptoms of dementia, if they didn't get out and about, that actually that was going to speed up the progression of the disease. I mean, this is a very, very crude extrapolation from this principle, because obviously not everyone is as vulnerable, but you could almost get a picture that there's a productivity risk with this kind of demotivated, deflated community who are sort of always kind of feasting on what is there. And if what is there is not renewing itself very often, or is static, or is in decline itself, then not getting enough stimulation or ideas. And I think that the sort of, then you kind of get into this risk point of people wanting to then get back to an earlier model of the city as a place where you do leave a neighbourhood, your home neighbourhood, behind, and you do so quite willingly, or you're actually quite motivated to go and to live your life in a different majority of your day in a different part of the city. So I think, you know, whilst any proponent of the 50-minute city probably doesn't actually think that there's a, you know, penalty for crossing town to sort of visit a favourite restaurant, or, you know, a black mark if you use the car for occasionally to go and do a sort of large grocery shop, I think there is really quite a big issue with the framing of the idea, because, you know, yes, talk about how policy needs to be better and planning needs to be better, and as Sam was just saying, how private sector could be better engaged with it too. But I suppose I'm interested in how people can, if they bought into the idea, how they could really sort of overcome some of these problems by wanting change to happen. And I think that there have been some justified criticisms of the 50-minute city because of this perceived rigidity to the thinking. So that the idea that it goes against the city as this place of traditional movement and metropolitan connections and exciting links between people and spontaneity and all of the other things that we think of cities sort of traditionally stoking in terms of social mobility as well. Again, sort of on the theme of flip sides and behaviour, I think it can be worthwhile to remember that some of the cycling cultures that we most look up to, such as those in Denmark and the Netherlands, they're not all that they seem, and Amsterdam in particular, cycling culture there was not created just by a sudden arrival of cyclists and hundreds of kilometres of cycle lanes, but it was really, as I'm sure everyone knows, like political activism in the 1970s and protests against fuel price increases and against this, tragic death toll of children caused by the proliferation of cars and motorways. In the motorways, in the sort of boom that followed, the building boom that followed the Second World War, that was what really caused the state to put down these bike lanes as a kind of appeasement, so that actually that was what people wanted, not what policy dictated. And as hardly stated, we're not in that position in the UK. We're trying to deliver this idea, we're trying to sell this idea to people, and it's not something that people, I don't think, are asking for, certainly not in Glasgow. And so I think my personal opinion is that we can't create thriving 15-minute cities or neighbourhoods just by providing the infrastructure for them. And to take an example again, close to home, there is a sustenance bike lane that was, widely consulted on, that links the south side to the merchant city, which is a kind of a lateral link that wasn't there before, and has definitely improved something, but it is to all intents and purposes, it's underused, and it's not entirely clear why. So I think that's just something that is yet unclear. I think, there've been other cities that have put down cycle lanes that people have actually asked to be removed. So I think that's thinking again, I think Ewan was mentioning this earlier about sort of how everything can fit into the piece, and so we can sort of find collective agency through individuals from the streets up, rather than ideally as the most sort of effective way to do this, rather than through policy. I think that is the key thing to unlock. I'm aware that we're running out of time, and I haven't really got into the next section, but I was going to talk a little bit, I've just rattled through this, but I was going to talk a bit about business. And I think it's very interesting, there was someone in the comments who noted that big business is as much the thing that's missing in rural areas as small businesses. But I think my focus just would be on the small business world, which is the one that I know. Again, people and agency, people seize this opportunity to pause the model of a city. It's a place with a centre, and then the radial neighbourhoods and the suburbs, and to accept that there would be dwindling resources the further out you go. So I think that there's this sort of trend for people to act as individual ambassadors, or even sort of mini treasurers for the postcode in which they would live. So people were placemaking and saying, this is my disposable income. If I allocate it to one shop rather than another, then I'm going to actually be shaping the place in which I live. And I say this anecdotally, but also through many, many examples of what people vocalize when they make choices. People want to shop small, and they, people come into my bookshop and say, can you buy this book? Here it is on Amazon. So I think there's a lot to be said for supporting this behaviour by subsidising material improvements to small businesses at state or council level. There are some funds and grants that exist to do this, but I think there needs to be more, and I think we need to sort of, excuse me, at least reflect or speculate on the idea that investing in communities through these kinds of means, could actually create, again, momentum for change, to create places where people wanted to walk around because there was enough to do, and that sometimes other things can follow from that. And so, yeah, I think these kind of very deliberate patronages of small local businesses express a self-interest in wanting to keep a community vibrant. I think we need to think about how we can get behind that behaviour as well. Although there is a risk of actually, you know, what follows is not just a kind of 20-minute neighbourhood, but a postcode with rising wealth, which is a slightly different outcome. So I'll just skip forward. I think the last thing I wanted to mention was time and behaviour. So time being cited by the very early proponents of the 15-minute city idea, people such as Carlos Moreno at the Sorbonne, who pitched what he called chrono-urbanism to the mayor Anne Hidalgo. I still don't really, if I'm honest, know exactly what he means by that term, but I think in its simplest form, he's saying that we can just think, have the idea of time high in our mind with regard to the city, and reapportion time by disrupting this kind of norm of commuting every day. But again, returning to how this links to thriving small businesses in neighbourhoods, we need people in a way to believe in that, because they need to advocate for hybrid working, which is something that bigger businesses are now pushing back on, because we need enough people around on the streets in order that the footfall is there to sustain a kind of a model of a much smaller business. I think the reluctance of the workforce to return to the office hopefully will mean that there is some longevity to working from home, but obviously this might not apply to the rural settings, but it's very, very important for larger cities. So yeah, I think that's probably as much time as I've got. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natalie. That's really interesting and also helpful to hear. I suppose it's really good to hear some of the sort of, I don't want to say adverse, but unintended consequences. So your comments on life space and our need for variety to maintain cognitive ability is a really interesting one. And the thing that I think I really enjoyed particularly about your book was, or struck a chord with me, was exercise, our commute being exercise. And you talked, I think, a bit about in London, you did thousands of steps, but now you have to purposefully walk for exercise. And I would say that's my experience as well. I hate exercise for exercise's sake. It's boring. And all my exercise has always been incidental to me going places. Whereas now that has also shifted, and my scales can attest to that. So that's helpful. I suppose that one of the local aspect in Scotland, we have Scotland Love Local, which is a sort of card. I don't know if you're part of it. I should acknowledge you're running a bookshop. That's more on us, but that's more a sort of local authority basis rather than a sort of local neighbourhood basis. Is it something that you've come across?
Yeah, I'm aware of it. I think I haven't yet implemented it because it's actually quite tricky to deliver as a business. Not so simple as, I mean, obviously I know people get these kind of prepaid cards, but to actually redeem the money as a business isn't particularly straightforward. So I haven't taken it out very readily, but I think obviously that kind of principle is a good one.
And I think it's good that you picked up on the issue of, I mean, I've seen criticism of the 15-minute city is it restrictive? And my understanding of it is about choice. So people should be able to choose to live, work, play locally, which picks up on one of the comments that's just come in around work from Peter Node. Do you think it is actually achievable for us to obviously in a Paris context, that's one of Carlos Moreno's big issues around being able to work locally. For most employers, certainly for people who work in the service industry, that's impossible because the service industry pays where you work. But do you think we are going to see a shift to people realistically working locally as well as living locally?
I think, unfortunately, I think it is going to just slip back towards to office culture as the sort of the dominant culture, and then, you know, perhaps a little bit of hybrid working. But I think the sort of the national need for productivity is really going to come into play. I think big businesses have to have the power to set their terms, and they represent the sort of majority of employment in the UK. So I don't see it having a sort of long-term future myself.
I suppose, I mean, it's interesting. I suppose one of the services that we are wanting cited locally are health services, but acknowledging that those services are provided by specialists. Can we insist that the specialists live local to the place of their employment? And the answer would be no. People who have specialist skills will always be travelling to their place of work. But it's one of the interesting aspects of it, and I suppose it's just why in a Scottish context, it seems to be access to transport, access to sustainable transport to your place of work through Mobility Hub, as Mark has talked about, seems to be one of the options. Can I ask the other panelists to sort of join us from a sort of more general discussion? I suppose one of the reflections, two reflections I want to give just now is your infraordinary comment. I know that during lockdown, the park that I walked in has a lot of gorse, and we discovered, and we still refer to this discussion, we had a long found ourselves in a long discussion about the different hues of yellow of different gorse plants. And we still go back to that as like, that was the lockdown highlight. We were so focused on our hyperlocal environment, we were beginning to detect very subtle shades of difference within them. I suppose the other observation I would make, because you've talked about time, and I was thinking about some of Husam's criticisms of our environment. I'm a child of McTaggart and Mickle cul-de-sac. Urbanists hate them. I loved it. It was an Olympic arena to us. It was great for hide and seek. But one of the observations, it was built in the mid-50s, and you know, it was it's a housing scheme. But at that time was different. Most of the houses were occupied by mothers who didn't work. Food was delivered. We had a baker's van that came round. We had a fish van. There was a butcher that came round. We didn't have a car. My dad didn't work within 15 minutes of the house. But there was a very different societal structure at that time as well. So it wasn't designed not to be an unlivable neighbourhood. It became, in some ways, an unlivable neighbourhood because other things in society changed around what was an urban centre. We had a really good bus network. The school was over a mile away, but that was viewed as fairly normal for us. So there's something around the time aspect, which Natalie, you referred to, and we now have less time potentially. And I think from a surf perspective, one of the things I would reflect on is we're looking at areas, we are focused on areas where there's multiple deprivation. And I suppose we may be talking about people who have children, 2 jobs, senior caring responsibilities, and you know their time is precious, and they maybe don't have time to walk to the shops because they do a weekly shop and they use their car and they try and maximize the use of all the time. So there's something around that sort of time, the ability for people to have time. And I think that's why I always use Paris as I don't want to talk about Paris in a Scottish context because it's not about strolling to work with a baguette and a coffee. It's not about that. That's not the thing we're looking at. We're looking to improve people's lives in a maybe more meaningful, non-Instagrammed way. But I'm interested to have your reflections or questions that you may have for each other as people that have all been chatting this morning. Husam, I know you have some reflections.
I just got a couple of points, if I may say. I do worry when some people really just summarize the 20 minutes neighborhood only in terms of connectivity. This is worrying to me. 20 minutes neighborhood is about a place, is really about a place. You cannot talk about connectivity, permeability, and the transportations and active travel in isolation. It's not about just how do I move from A to B. It's about a place. This is why density, intensity, and proximity is part of the equation. We have to speak about those three together, if I may say. They are not in isolation. So that's one thing. Otherwise, there is a danger that 20 minutes neighborhood could be so technical and so abstract subject, if I may say, like any other subject. That's one thing. For the private sectors, I think we need to show them the evidence. We need to show them the evidence why the 20 minutes neighborhood. I have to admit, I met some of the private sector. I have been very lucky here in Dundee, and I'm happy to share this with you without naming the person at all. I work with my students in an area in Dundee, and there is an ongoing delivery of houses there from a landowner. And he got excited about what we have done. And I have to tell you now, on the back of what we deliver, and we show them why better density is a vital option for him and for the community. So we try to show him it is win-win. I have to admit now, he came back to us now and he asked us for help. So raising awareness and showing evidence is very crucial. Why? Because those people are not willing to take a risk. This is how they see it. And they have been for 40 years now delivering one types of houses. We need to diversify this. And the only things if we show options. Another things, I am a big fan I think the Scottish government need to show Scottish people 3 prototypes. So we all aspire to. We need to show what is good density and intensity in urban sense, in suburbia and in rural. I don't think there is, how do you want me to say, an evidence in Scotland, apart from some historical villages. We need to show those deliveries so we aspire to. So I think we need, yeah.
I suppose on that point, I suppose it's interesting because I suppose the government in the 20th Century Review response have said they're going to have some demonstrator 20-minute neighbourhoods. And so maybe this is an opportunity for them to do that. Before I take Stuart and Anne your hands, Joanna, you put your hand up, you had a question.
I'm not really talking so much about the whole 20-minute neighbourhood, although I think it's a brilliant idea that we only maybe will achieve, but more about things that have been happening in the last 3 years. I've been retired all that time, but both my sons have been working from home either all the time or part the time. And they both say that although they don't think that they will be working from home 100% of the time, they think their businesses will be expecting them to work from home some of the time. That has implications for less car use. It has implications for possibly having some kind of home working hub support in neighborhoods. And in the time that we all have, if you don't have to commute, you have more time to do other things. And if you are more in your locality where your home is, it may help build the community around as you get to know some of your neighbors better. So I think some of the changes that the pandemic has brought have implications for the 20-minute neighborhood. Thank you.
They do, thank you very much, Anna. But obviously they have implications as well as the cost of heating our homes actually will be something that the heating was always off in my house. It is now because it's April, but that is obviously something that's putting pressure on people. Stuart, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I think I take the point that Husam made about place, but I think also thinking about people and lifestyle, which is kind of what Natalie was talking about, is what sort of lifestyle are we actually expecting people to live? And that's quite different from there's 20-minute neighbourhoods already, which are fantastic places to live in your West End Glasgows and your Marchmonts. But how does that actually work in a poorer area that is the, you know, the economy? So we're going back to regeneration. Is there a reason to be there or not? So, you know, it might be 20-minute neighbourhood, but I think we sometimes just need to get back to basics and all this stuff.
Which actually is mirrored in some of the comments that I think, Pam, you and the head of planning at 5 Pencil made was that 20 minute neighbourhoods are just good planning, and that we really need to be delivering good planning. And you had your hand up, you've taken it down. Did you want to say something?
Thanks. Yeah, just really following up on the jobs thing and thinking, you know, reflecting on when I've been going out and about in North Lanarkshire, a lot of these areas did have reasonable density, did have a lot of things because they were based around jobs, and those jobs of, you know, traditional steelworking, whatever, those jobs go, and the importance of, when we're thinking of planning, you know, the location of jobs, and I think the working from home, I think that has implications for, if we're talking about density, if we're looking at the size of units that people live in. If you don't have anywhere to have a home desk, that's one issue, as well as if you have the type of job that can be done from home, and that, you know, and if usually it's people in poorer areas that are doing jobs that they have to go to anyway. So I think jobs, and it's been mentioned here, so just to reflect, I think that's really important, because a lot of the places where I go, and it comes back also to the care and maintenance of those places and the sense of place, sense of community, by, you know, having activity. I mean, we were reflecting yesterday that the community centre used to be open every day and was somewhere you could drop into and was the hub of the community, and that's now, it has to be booked, it has to be done, that, you know, things, so much has changed, and I think it is about what we want to create around place, and that, yeah, it's complicated. That's really it's complicated.
I know I've said to you, Anna, I think it's a simple concept, and in some levels it is, but I agree, delivering it is complicated. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of scuttled round it a wee bit, but I think the elephant in the room here is money. That
was my conclusion.
sorry to jump in. I mean, if we talk Paris, you know, they're pumping absolutely billions into this concept, you know, and we in Scotland are very good at going, that's a great idea. And then as soon as somebody says, if we get any money for it, we'll whistle and look the other way and go, we'll manage, we'll do this somehow, you know. And I think it's that dilution of an idea around its economics that really kind of actually makes this very, very difficult to deliver. I live in Dunblane. It's a hugely affluent town, probably one of the most affluent in Scotland, 8,000 people, which would be absolutely ripe for a 20-minute neighbourhood. Do I honestly think that this is something that we can deliver in its entirety in Dunblane? Not a chance, because, you know, the work element of it isn't here. The play element really isn't here either, beyond, you know, walking out of town and into the surrounding countryside. Everything is in Glasgow and Edinburgh and Stirling. So I think the challenges are huge. I'm not saying we can't deliver. We can deliver a lot of them, but it's the economics of it that really worry me in this instance. I think we're being naive at a government level if we think we can deliver this without a massive influx of money. And I know some of it's there in areas, but I think to deliver this as a legitimate and holistic concept, the money needs to be in one pot, and we use it accordingly to deliver one thing, which is the 20-minute neighbourhood principle. But beyond that, if the money's not there, then it's a dilution of it.
Okay, I don't agree with you, and I suppose that I was going to conclude on that because Nick, well, you referred to the unknown cost of a mobility hub, but your words suggested they were not going to be happening for free. And Nick's presentation, you obviously showed us there were pound signs next to some of the things that you were saying were needed in that. And I suppose I was going to ask you all, you know, my question was, are we realistic about the cost? And I think it's a criticism of NPF4 was it doesn't come with a detailed delivery mechanism. Are the costs, is it achievable?
Chip in. Yes, it is achievable. I think it's completely achievable, but it will take resources. So in a way, I'm very heartened by what you said at the start of the session, Ewan, that the thing you heard last night from Tom Arthur, that they're going to take their time. And if taking their time means not just getting the policy right, which is important, but also getting the delivery plan right as well. If they can come up with, I mean, politics is the art of the possible. It's all about making things work financially. That's all linked with independence and everything else and all sorts of complicated politics there. But it is perfectly possible to do it if people do exactly as Mark said, and if there's money available. So it's perfectly possible.
That's a good note for us to end on. I mean, I would say, you know, criticisms around 20-minute neighbourhoods, to me, one of them not being new, the fact that they will be Scottish planning policy for at least 10 years means that it will take a long time for culture change and for things to actually happen on the ground. To me, is the thing that maybe heartens me, which is why it needs to be improved or enhanced from the current wording that we currently see in policy. But I think we also have to accept, you know, I think Natalie's point around the imposition, we can't make people change. The two of the political parties where I live are, their ticket for this local election is against spaces for people, because they don't like the way it's been delivered in the part of Edinburgh that I live in. And I don't think that's the only place that that's happening. At the same time, I know in Postle Park, there's a cycleway there that the community put in against the wishes of the council, but it's now then becoming a permanent cycleway because it was the community that actually led on that. So which is a good example of why our understanding of 20-minute neighbourhoods and the community control of what that looks like is crucial. And I think some of that discussion we're having now may be picked up on in future events. One of the reasons that we would like to talk to Aberdeenshire councils, because we know that they're looking at how they allocate their capital budget around the 20-minute neighbourhood concept. And we think that is ultimately going to be vital to the success of this as a policy in the round, both in terms of new build, retrofit, and quality and experience of the place, as you've all referred to. So it's 1 o'clock. Thank you very much to all the panelists that have given up their time, and to those who have put questions in and chat in the sidebar. You've had some really interesting comments. Kate Juster has put some comments in which have been picked up by Anne, but also the benefits of not running a car, how we can do that so cheaply. So thank you very much to Natalie, to Nick, to Husam, to Stuart, to Mark, and to Anne for your time this morning. And we will no doubt see you all in a few months when we carry on the discussion around 20-minute neighbourhoods. And everyone have a lovely afternoon.